Good morning everybody. It is July 3rd and that means it is Gettysburg 161 and we are looking across the field of Pickett's charge. We're so glad you're joining us this morning. I'm Garry Adelman, that's Kris White behind the camera. We've got Kay Bierle over there. We've got additional guests going to be joining us along the way and we really hope you enjoy this. We really hope this is meaningful for you and you have an important and meaningful commemoration as we explore Gettysburg and show you as much of the battlefield as we can. We're going to be going across the field of Pickett's charge here today, and then we're going to be covering other things on July 3rd. For our Culp's Hill coverage, for so many other parts of the battlefield, please see our previous videos. We have more than 1,200 videos on YouTube, and a solid 300 of those are about Gettysburg. But with no further ado, you're looking across the field of Pickett's charge. You're really looking to the east, and we're along the line of the Confederates here. They are stretching for 6 miles here and they're going to stack up and try to send a lot of people across this field on July 3rd. I'm wagering you already kind of know that story. So I want to get things going a little bit to talk about. We're standing at a cannon here. This looks like a Parrott rifle cannon and there's going to be a huge bombardment before the famous attack known as Pickett's Charge or the Pickett Pettigrew Tremble Assault or Longstreet's Assault. Call it what you'd like to. And I'd like to open it up with Wayne Motts, my good friend, one of my first Civil War friends, President Emeritus and historian of the Gettysburg Foundation, licensed battlefield guide. Wayne, how you doing?
Thank you, Garry. I appreciate it. Thank you for the invitation for being out here this morning on behalf of the Gettysburg Foundation. So everyone, I know you're probably familiar with the beginnings of Pickett's Charge, but one of the integral parts of it is going to be an artillery barrage or preparation prior to this attack on July 3rd, 1863. And we're standing at one of the guns, as Garry mentioned, for A.P. Hill's artillery involved in that attack on July 3rd, 1863. Now, what are the goals of this artillery bombardment for July 3rd? Well, one of the goals was to destroy enemy morale. Of course, the second goal is to destroy enemy troops, and the third goal is to destroy enemy artillery, beat up the Union line so that when these troops cross across this field on July 3rd, you won't have a lot of resistance. And in that fact, and we're going to talk more about it with our whole group, that really wasn't successful. It's, in my opinion, it's the reason why we had a failure of the attack on July 3rd, 1863. The number of guns involved in this cannonade, it went from 1 to 3 o'clock on July 3rd, 1863, is probably going to be over 150 pieces of artillery on July 3rd. And on this side, where we're at right now for A.P. Hill, there's probably 60-some guns, 63 guns, and for Longstreet's artillery, under E. Porter Alexander, the number of guns about 75. And this bombardment will take place beginning at 1 p.m. on July 3rd, and it will create an incredible amount of artillery fire between the two armies on July 3rd, 1863. Now, part of this problem is going to be coordination, and unfortunately, we don't really have very much of that. So I'd like to call up my good friend and battlefield guide, professor at the U.S. Army War College, and many other titles, which I can't remember, Douds. And let Doug talk about, the coordination of this, because it's tremendous.
Oh, good morning, Wayne. Yeah. So we think about this, you know, when we come up with this plan for July 3rd, this is going to be a multi-corps attack with multi-corps worth of artillery. So when we think about who owns that, when Robert E. Lee talks about their failures on July 2nd, except for that proper concert of action, we would have been successful. Who's responsible for the proper concert of action? One could argue it's Robert E. Lee. And if you're going to go ahead and make a multi-corps attack, then Lee should be coordinating it, and his chief of artillery, William Pendleton, should be. But we know William Pendleton is largely an incompetent artillerist, and with the reorganization of Lee's army at the end of May, I would argue Lee has effectively scoped the talent of William Pendleton by ensuring that he commands 0 pieces of artillery, and we've gotten rid of the artillery reserve. So what we really have now are 2 corps that are next to each other. Longstreet is given command of this attack. We'll line up all the troops here in a moment. But who is to coordinate all this? You know, even when we talk about E. Porter Alexander, that's not even Longstreet's chief of artillery. He's one of the battalion commanders. So is he supposed to coordinate multiple corps worth of artillery? That doesn't seem practical either. And he will be highly critical of how this bombardment is arranged, that they don't take advantage. They know they're targeting a fishhook-shaped line. So the advantage would be to ring the end of the fishhook with artillery, but they don't do that. Moreover, if we think about the organization of Confederate batteries, usually mixed, 2 rifled pieces, 2 smoothbore in an often case, so they can have effect at range and in close. But what that means is for many of the artillery pieces trying to fire across this field without range, what they would do is take the smooth bores that didn't have the range and they would push them out of the way. So E. Porter Alexander would say there were some 56 pieces of artillery that should have been engaged here that were not. That lack of coordination may contribute to some of the effects that they achieve or do not achieve. And if we look across the field too, if we're looking out there, you can see the obelisk monument of the U.S. regulars, and just to the left of it, the copse of trees, relatively speaking, the aim point for this attack. You can see there's not a lot of elevation for those artillery pieces to hit over there. And they'll make a big deal about the number of Confederate overshoots. And some people will say, oh, well, the problem is they're pulling the lanyard and tails are digging in, and that's elevating the barrels, and I think that's all bunk. These guys are experts at firing the artillery after 2 years of war. And you could say, well, it's partly responsible to poorly manufactured artillery shells. That might be true. But ultimately, the Confederates know they're going to attack this Union fishhook line. And if you're going to hit the center of it, one thing you cannot afford for there to be is a conveyor belt of reinforcements behind that. I would argue overshoots were not only expected, they were desired. If we wrote that mission today for the artillery, we would say isolate that piece of the battle space. So many of those overshoots, Meade's headquarters, the artillery reserve, the ambulance park, and all the reserves standing behind that line get driven off, so all we have is this thin crust to punch through. I would argue that was actually anticipated and expected if we were going to make this attack work. Oh, I'm going to hand this off to Kris White, American Battlefield Trust. Good morning, Kris.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. I just want to jump on real fast before I turn it over to Garry and just say I think that's a very interesting assessment here, and I agree with what Doug's saying. And there is a difference between a bombardment and a barrage. A bombardment is going to soften up a position. A barrage means barrier. Literally, we're going to create a barrier between us and this artillery. That is going to try to slow them down. So as the Union Army bombards this position, they will then switch into a barrage situation where the Confederate infantry start marching in that direction. So what they're going to try to do is create a barrier. That's exactly what Doug is pointing out for the Confederates. They're going to soften up the position with a bombardment, but to create a barrage, hopefully, to stop that or stop those reinforcements coming to the front. So it's always interesting. The different perspectives out here, and we're doing this on the fly. So I totally agree with Doug, but I also like to take it that one step farther here between a bombardment and a barrage. And there are differences here in the terminology and what we'll see with artillery evolving over the next 80 years.
I'm not sure. Did Kris just say that Doug Douds came up a little bit short in his description of the artillery?
I don't think I did say that. I was agreeing with him and just reinforcing what he was saying.
Okay, I could have sworn I heard something else. You're with the American Battlefield Trust. It is an international morning again. We've got Australia, we've got England, we've got the Netherlands, we've got New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Georgia here. Come on, West Coasters, it's time to get up and join us for our coverage here. Thanks to Ghost of Sickles' Leg, you continue to win the prize for the best handle so far. Rebel 5 is loving where we happen to be right now. And there's hashtag Garry and Wayne. Our movements are awesome. Before we get on to our guests real quick, our next guest, let me just say a couple of things. You're familiar with this charge. You might know it as Pickett's charge. You might know it as the Pickett, Pettigrew, Trimble assault, okay? And those are divisions, of course. Of course, Pickett's division famously has Armistead, Garnett, and Kemper. You've got Trimble, a demi sort of division of 2 brigades that came from Pender's division. That is Scales and Lane actually going into the assault. Then you've got, of course, Pettigrew, which used to be Heath's division, and that is Archer, Davis, Pettigrew, and Brockenbrough, and a couple of those are under different people. Pettigrew is under Fry, you've got, Archer's under Fry, Pettigrew is under Marshall, and it's getting confusing, so I'm guessing Kris put up a map, and I now see that he did.
So what I tried to do is, Garry totally pulled a Chris Bukowski on me by dropping every name of the Confederate High Command, so I tried to get as many pictures in there as humanly possible. Thank you, Chris Bukowski / Garry Adelman. But now I'm just showing a map because I've given up editing on the fly.
I do this to Kris and my whole team and other people I don't even know with great frequency, but I wanted to set that up to say that the command is askew. You have people fighting heavily on July 1st, and now they're not only fighting again in Pickett's charge or Pickett, Pettigrew, Trimble assault, but also they are now fighting under new commanders, and that's making hundreds of command changes during this chaotic event. And that brings us down to the sort of person level, and that's what the National Civil War Museum does so well. And we're going to join our friends with some objects from the National Civil War Museum. They've got some things from Pickett's division, they've got some things from Pettigrew's division, and let's go over and see what they got. You already know them from our previous video. Here's Mike. You're seeing him from the reverse side. I'm not going to say if that's his better or worse side there. And Dane, who's the educator there. What do you got, guys?
So we have a diary that was written by Private Thomas Bailey, a member of Company E of the 47th North Carolina and Pettigrew's Brigade. Bailey was a 40-year-old farmer from Wake County, North Carolina. He enlisted in the Army in February 1862 as a private, and up until this point in the war was going pretty good for him. He had relatively decent health up to and through Gettysburg. After Gettysburg, not so much the case. He would be hospitalized at Danville, furloughed, sick, become a POW at Hatcher's Run in 1865. So Bailey would then eventually take the oath of allegiance at Hart's Island, New York, as a prisoner of war. In this diary, there are some brief references to what was going on at the time. Bailey says on July 2nd, he spent the night until noon burying the dead. Had heavy skirmishing on the south of Gettysburg all in the morning. And then on the 3rd, around 1:30, the artillery opens rapidly. There's a roar of arms. And he mentions also on the 3rd that the artillery opened up at the rate of 45 rounds per minute south of town. So it's quite an interesting account. Very difficult, or very poor condition, you can say that diary is. We also have a letter here. A letter relates to the 55th North Carolina, and that particular letter was written by a first lieutenant named Henry T. Jordan, an adjutant of the regiment. And he wrote that to his aunt while a prisoner of war in Johnson's Island in Ohio. And this letter is dated March 2nd, 1864, but he's referencing Gettysburg. He's trying to recreate the historical account. And he says that one of the soldiers in his regiment, an Edward F. Satterfield, was killed at Pickett's charge, and he was one of 3 Southern soldiers who had advanced further than any other closest to that stone wall out there on Cemetery Ridge. So that is a very interesting account in the sense that it reconstructs what he believed occurred here at Gettysburg.
All right, is that your stuff for now, Dane? Mm-hmm. All right, good. Thanks so much to you guys. I mean, you've been bringing out stuff on almost every walk, sometimes waiting for us to change the plan where we do it. So we really appreciate you coming out. There's something about the stuff that really brings this story all together.
All I want to say is from behind the camera, 3 historians came up, and all I'm hearing is, wow, look, I believe it. Everybody was really excited for this stuff. So head over to the National Civil War Museum in Harrisburg and see it for yourself.
Good. Even while you're in Gettysburg, take a couple hours out. It's only about 55 minutes away from here. You can head on north. We're going to leave our friends in the dust again as we go toward the field of Pickett's charge. Here we go. Now we're moving from near the North Carolina monument that you would have seen at the outset and over toward the Tennessee troops. Now, we've got Tennessee troops in this battle. They're part of Fry's brigade. That's more commonly known as Archer's brigade, but Archer was captured on the first day of the battle. Again, these guys in Pickett's charge fought on the first day. They showed an artifact just now from the 55th North Carolina. Some of you are familiar with the way that large regiment swung through the field and compromised the Union right flank on the first day. And here they are after only 1 day of rest so far. So we're talking about, guys that Lee just doesn't have the men that he wants in order to do everything he wants. And I see Doug's got the mic, so he's going to get it.
All right, gang. So when you think about, Garry just talked about all the losses they have. Douglas Southall Freeman, who's kind of the ultimate biographer of Lee and Lee's lieutenants, he would say the choice made to put the units chosen to make this attack is one of Lee's most egregious errors here at Gettysburg. And for Douglas Southall Freeman to say that about Robert E. Lee, that's saying something. Because when we think about this, everybody talks about, Meade has his council war on the evening of July 2nd. When we think about who does Lee meet with on July 3rd, well, he talks to A.P. Hill. We know he talks to Jeb Stuart, and otherwise he just receives aids from Longstreet and Ewell. When we talk about that concert of action, the Union at the end of day 2, they've got a common common operational picture. They got a common idea what they want to do. They want to stay and they defend. And we know when they do the math, they think they have 58,000 soldiers. Because Lee never has that meeting, how would he know? And we think about the things you need to know on a battlefield. You need to know yourself, you need to know the enemy, and you need to know the environment. Arguably, the thing Lee knows the least about is his own army, because he doesn't get those guys all in one room to talk about, hey, how they doing, so that he could inquire of A.P. Hill what troops would best be served to place in that. And so because he defers that decision, now all of a sudden we end up with units that get chewed up on day one, when there were others that could have been chosen if he really wanted to plus up the combat power that he needed here to make this charge. I'm going to bring on Wayne.
Oh, yeah, well, I want you to stay. You can stay here with me, because I think that's the point that you're making about there's a great scene in Gettysburg, the movie, that didn't happen, and it's the scene that should have happened, Doug, and it's the scene you're talking about, where Tom Behringer comes in and starts to draw a map on the ground, and he describes how the unit, now he reverses the units while they're lined up, but he's actually got Pettigrew with him, he's got Trimble with him, he's got everybody with him, and if that scene would have happened,
it's true,
we may have had a different outcome of the coordination of it. Now, you mentioned not only on the infantry, but let's talk a little bit about the artillery, because you mentioned a lot about that. So if you look at the artillery reports for the 3 artillery commanders that were here, Reuben Lindsay Walker's the man in charge of the artillery for A.P. Hill, of course, the de facto head for Longstreet, and Stapleton Crutchfield, is out, I think. So you've got Brown, I think, is the person in charge of Ewell's artillery. But if you look at the official record, there isn't, right? I mean, there's hardly anything in the official records about how the artillery's supposed to be working together on all this.
Yeah, on top of that, just think about all the irregular things about, how much ammunition do we have? We're going to talk about, E. Porter Alexander will talk about, hey, we didn't have much. I refilled my cases from the night before. There wasn't a whole lot. Well, does Lee know that? Because in his report, he goes, our dearth of ammunition was a factor that was unknown to me. Unknown to you? You're going to put 150 cannons in here, and your success of this attack is going to rely upon your long arm. And that, again, goes back to good staff work. Had we had that meeting, so at least people could have asked one another, how you guys doing? What do you have left? They might have made more educated decisions about how they would have prioritized either units or how they would have adjusted their fires.
Right. And this is the Chief of Staff's responsibility, right?
That's exactly right.
This is going to be the Chief of Staff's responsibility to let Robert E. Lee know, hey, here's some things you need to be aware of. And these decisions are made early morning for July 3rd. And we're using the word Pickett's charge. I don't know, Gary may get it. We got to be careful. Pettigrew and Trimble's charge. We can call it whatever we want to call it.
Yeah.
As I tell everybody, if you can't beat them, join them, because everybody said that. But we're not going to, obviously we're here on the northern wing of this attack, but there doesn't appear this coordination, these decisions are made south of where we're standing, and by the time those decisions are made and comes back up here, it doesn't look like there's a lot of information going to these troops that are here on the northern portion of the attack. We know that Burkett Fry, who's on the right of this attack, is told to work with Garnett, and the two of them together are to work out a dress, how this attack's going to line up. But there doesn't seem to be much else, I don't think. Is that right, Doug?
Exactly right. We know Lee and Longstreet ride the lines twice. Hill joins them for part of that. Yeah. But other than that, we know when this whole thing kicks off, Pickett rides over to Longstreet. I'm going to take my division in the attack. Well, who passes it to Pettigrew or Trimble?
Right.
The only thing we really have is, there is perhaps the opportunity that Porter Alexander will send a courtesy note, as he sends a note to Pickett, to send one to Pettigrew. But even as they step off this ridgeline, and we'll talk about this as this attack goes, right, it unfolds with Pickett going, and then it almost comes off and echeloning to the north, because really each unit is going, oh, there they go. We got to go, and therefore they're all slightly late, and therefore it ends up almost staggered as it goes to the north due to the lack of coordination.
And we should also mention that this artillery was intended to follow the infantry as well. It was intended to support what the infantry was going to do here, and there are very few sources of guns that actually went forward, and a lot of that has to do with the lack of ammunition. Alexander says that he checks the limbers to make sure how much ammunition they have, and then chooses guns that are going to go forward, but there aren't many that are able to go forward. So there's not only the bombardment accomplishments that need to be done, but then there's an advance, and that doesn't appear to be done either. So I think, Chris, you want to get in? And
it's the double mic swap. Go ahead, Chris.
So I just wanted to add two things. Number one, Reuben Lindsay Walker, completely useless piece of information, is allegedly the most handsome man in the Confederacy. But the other thing I want to just reinforce, and I'm not saying Doug's wrong, Gary.
Let's hear it.
And Wayne, is that Robert Chilton, who's the chief of staff, and I'm not trying to pass the buck to that Robert E. Lee's also wrong here, but Robert Chilton is a terrible chief of staff within the Army of Northern Virginia. He did not do well with Lee's Special Order 191. At Chancellorsville, he pulled off Jubal Early's division, nearly opening the back door to Chancellorsville for the Union Army. Here, he's not doing his job. And just to show you what the Confederate Congress thought of him, who had to approve his promotion to Brigadier General, even with the backing of Robert E. Lee, they do not approve his promotion from Colonel to Brigadier General. I think that says a lot about Robert Chilton, the Chief of Staff of the Army of Northern Virginia.
That it does indeed. Thanks, Kris. I think you just said Doug was wrong again, man. You're with the American Battlefield Trust. We got hundreds of people watching, and we're glad to have you here. And apparently, let's see, Doug is a heavy hitter. Wayne, gotta love him. And ABT is the GOAT. Well, if I may, for those of you who are maybe older than 11 or 12, greatest of all time is GOAT. And I think John Eden's the GOAT for your unbelievable generosity during all of these lives. And Julian as well coming in on this. And it's starting to move west. We got Cincinnati, we got Michigan, we got Chicago. So let's see if we can get it all the way over to California as well. A couple of things real quick. And hello to Wolf Tracks, by the way. Welcome back. Here we are at the Tennessee Memorial. We've moved over a little bit. We're going to hear from our friends in just a second here. But just real quick, I mean, these monuments that we go by, and this was, I believe, the last of the Confederate state memorials erected here in the 1980s. It's got 3 stars on top to symbolize the 3 parts of Tennessee from which these units came. And if you ever want to anger a Tennessee person, call it Central Tennessee and see how they scream at you about it being middle. And the 3 soldiers on top, I believe, are for the 3 regiments from Tennessee that fought here. There's a cool relief of the state of Tennessee around the base. The monuments are symbolic, and they not only say what happened where, but they tell us about that place. Now, unless anybody else is claiming the mantle, I believe we're going to move it over to our friends again from the National Civil War Museum, standing out in the heat. What do you guys have for us now?
We have 3 artifacts that relate to some of the Virginia units that were involved in the Pickett Pettigrew Trimble assault. The first is a photograph of a veteran. His name is Charles Peyton. And Peyton was a 20-year-old farmer at the time of enlistment from Stony Point, Virginia. He would be commissioned into Company E of the 19th Virginia in Garnett's Brigade, transferred out in 1864, and then as a result of his service here at Gettysburg, he would wind up in the Confederate version of the Veterans Reserve Corps. This gentleman, Peyton here, was wounded on July the 3rd here at Gettysburg in the leg, and that is because that is the reason why he had to leave his regiment, the 19th Virginia. He would eventually, here at Gettysburg, he'd be a lieutenant colonel in this regiment at the time. So very important staff position, high-ranking officer here at the time of the battle. Next piece we have is a cased 1/6 plate ambrotype of Sergeant James O.B. Racer of Company K of the 7th Virginia. He would be in Kemper's Brigade. And this is a waist-up view of him wearing his uniform. Racer was a sergeant from Madison Courthouse, Virginia. He would be mustered into the Company K of the 7th in 1861. He would be captured here at Gettysburg and wounded on the 3rd day. And his fate was not so good, because on the 15th of July, he would die from his wounds, or succumb to his wounds. So that is a incredible remnant of the impact of this assault on the individual. The third piece we have is a wallet or billfold that was owned by 2nd Lieutenant Thomas Hatcher, of Company A of the 14th Virginia. Hatcher was in Armistead's brigade, and he was a native of Lombardy Grove, Virginia, enlisted as a private, and would eventually work his way up through the ranks, become captured here at Gettysburg on the 3rd day, wounded here in this assault on the 3rd day, and he would be sent to Johnson's Island Prison, sent to Point Lookout, Maryland, kind of bounce around between prisoner of war camps. That wallet was found here on the battlefield with 8 Confederate dollar bills in there. Quite an impressive piece, wonderful remnant. On prior tours of the battlefield, I have I have walked across this very assault with that piece, and that is probably one of the most touching experiences I've ever had in walking the assault.
Thanks so much, Dane, and to Mike here. I just can't thank you guys enough because there's something missing when you don't have the stuff, you know? And I'm telling you, the National Civil War Museum in Harrisburg, I've said it before, north, south, east, west, male, female, black, white, and everything. They cover the broad swath of the war. It's more than worth a trip up there. And look for our video series where we'll highlight just some of the great artifacts in their collections coming out soon. Now, we're about to walk the field of Pickett's charge. We're going to leave these guys in the Douds, but before we do, I think our own Sarah, Kay Bierle, has something to offer.
Thanks, Gary. Now we're standing here looking across these fields, and this is a view that some of the Confederate soldiers saw before they made the charge, perhaps while the artillery is firing, perhaps before, perhaps after. And some soldiers would get really honest about how they felt in the moment before or during this attack. And there's one soldier's account and his words that kind of stick with me. Now, he wrote this in the early 20th century. He says that he's writing 47 years after this happened. And there's certainly some things in his article that we might call into question compared to other sources. But the personal part of his story, and I think resonates really well, is what he talks about coming out on this field. So he's a sergeant in the 14th Tennessee Regiment. So they are in Archer's Brigade at the beginning of the battle. They would have fought across the land of on July 1st, 1863. They're coming across land that American Battlefield Trust is working to preserve near Willoughby's Run. And then we've talked about how commanders switch, and they are going to be brought into this attack, prepared to go across these fields once the artillery ends. Now, June Kimball, or Junius Kimball, as he's referred to on his enlistment papers, he comes out and he's looking across this field, and he'll later write that he says to himself, "June Kimball, will you do your duty today?" So standing out here, thinking to himself, speaking out loud to himself as he's looking across the field, probably from a position very near where we're standing here today. June Kimball, will you do your duty today? And he says that he answered himself that yes, he would. Yes, that he would try, and as a sergeant, he's going to form with his men, make the attack across the field. I'll give a little bit of spoilers to finish June Kimball's story. He makes it to the Union side of the lines. He says that he gets into the position of the angle, or up in that area, and he says he turns and he looks behind him looking for supports, and he says he doesn't see the supports that are needed to be able to hold on to the brief breakthrough position. And then he realizes he's going to have to attack or retreat from this attack. So June Kimball says he runs the first 100 yards out of the Union position as fast as lightning, according to his account. And then he realizes he might get shot. He might get shot in the back if he keeps running across these open fields. So he says in his account that he's made himself stop. And he turned back to face the Union position, and he walks backwards, getting back up into this area where he'll form with other survivors, awaiting what orders will come next. So as we stand here this morning, we look across these fields, kind of those echoes of the words, "Will you do your duty today?" And of course, these are questions that are echoing in the minds of many soldiers on both sides of the field here, but will you do your duty today? And as we get ready to make our walk across the field, usually, unless you have other transportation arranged, when you're walking on battlefields, you're then going to have to probably walk back across the same path. So if you have the opportunity today or on another visit to Gettysburg, and you are walking in the Confederate soldiers' footsteps across in the attack path, when it's time to walk back across the fields, come back to your vehicles, think about what that could have been like, what that must have been like for the survivors of the charge, coming back across the fields, perhaps seeing comrades on the ground, wondering what happens next. Will there be a Union counterattack? Will they be ordered to charge again? But think about, too, the idea of duty that's coming into these soldiers' minds. Do we want to walk with our back to the enemy, or do we walk in our retreat still facing our enemy across the field? Just some thoughts as we get ready to start our walk across the field, Gary.
Good, good. We're going to take a few steps here. I'll orient everybody, and then we're going to go to that next fence and take a look at the field of Pickett's Charge or Pickett Pettigrew Trimble Assault. Everybody's in my head about calling it the wrong thing. You're with the American Battlefield Trust. We're commencing our walk of the field of Pickett's Charge right here. We are headed eastward towards Cemetery Ridge in the distance. Seminary Ridge is right behind us. Pickett's division would be off to our right, and the rest of the North Carolina and Virginia troops and Tennessee troops would be off to our left. So in other words, we're right near the outset of the charge here. Imagine what this field would be like. You'd have dead and wounded skirmishers out in the field. You'd have artillery guns blazing with smoke hanging over the still landscape because there was basically no wind that day to carry all that smoke away. So it would have been an eerie scene, one that defies description, but we try nonetheless, and coming out here is one of the best things. One thing, Kris, I'd like to point you to off to the right is you can see the big pointy hill off in the distance with woods all over it. That is Big Round Top, and the little shelf to its left is Little Round Top. And we are outside of Union artillery range, but Pickett's division off on the right there, especially Kemper's brigade, is going to be subject to Union artillery fire from the flank while the Union artillery is tearing gaps into the Confederate line up here. I wanted to say thanks again. We got Kevin, we got Ham Cubes, my favorite handle so far of this particular live, Carlton, and Faye. Thanks so much for your generosity. And we're seeing all sorts of great things, people loving Sarah's stories and whatnot. And here we are with Wayne Motts and Doug Douds and Kris, Sarah, and I, and we are walking across the field of Pickett's Charge. Anybody have anything to add before we stop up here?
Gary, I just want to say maybe we ought to talk a couple things about prisoners, because we mentioned men being captured on multiple occasions here. So as these troops are walking across here, we've got several different types of prisoners. We've got prisoners taken in action. Some of them are taken closer up to the Union line. We have troops that are wounded that go back, that are taken once they end up being wounded. And usually the procedure is if they aren't paroled, signed off right away, then they'll go to a prisoner of war camp, and they separate the officers from the enlisted men. So it's pretty common in the Civil War for for the officers to go up to Johnson's Island Prison, which is up on Lake Erie, and then obviously the enlisted men we'll go to a number of different places. You mentioned a couple of those places earlier, Kris did, and some others. And so it's very common that these prisoners get divided up by their rank. And if you're wounded, you may go to a processing station like down at Fort McHenry, and some of these men are so badly wounded, they end up getting exchanged pretty much right away because nobody wants to really take care of them. If you're fit for duty, that's going to be a completely different story. That's here. Why don't we pause here for a couple seconds? And Gary, I don't know if you want us to mention, but you can see where the round tops are in the background. You've got Big Round Top, you got Little Round Top, you've got the barn that's off over here right in front of you with the 3 white points. That's the Nicholas Kadori barn, but that barn is a barn that was put there in 1882. So just remember that the early barn that was here during Pickett's Charge, you could not see that, or you would just see the top of it because it's smaller and it's white during the time of the battle. As you move up to the left, you'll see the Pennsylvania Memorial, George Standard's Vermonters, the United States Regular Memorial. You'll see the copse of trees, which will be, as Doug has pointed out, the aiming point for July 3rd, 1863. And then further, right up off this fence line, you'll see the white farm of Abraham Bryan, and that'll be the extreme left of this northern wing of the assault, which we're walking here. And Kris, I think if you could kind of pan around, because one of the things we want to show is how much we came down into this low area. Terrain really means an awful lot here. So if you look at the North Carolina Memorial and the Tennessee Monument where we just were up in the distance, we just came a couple hundred yards, but now when you come down here, you're down in this low piece of ground, and you're going to come up to this next ridge, which we'll talk about in a few moments with everybody, and then you're going to go back down. But the terrain here, everybody's different. If you walk this into the attack, you have this undulation, you've got some low curves in the ground. If you go over to Pickett's division, you're going to have some more of that. So every regiment you walk here on July 3rd, the terrain is a little bit different. In the experience of the soldiers are different. And Kris, if you take one last time, I'll ask these guys to move out one little thing. Look right here off the right of your frame or the front of your frame as you're looking. You'll notice that over on the other side of where this little hill is, right in front of where you're viewing, you can't see the left of where Pickett's division is when you're down inside this hole. So a lot of these folks are saying, where are the Virginians? You're a Virginian, you're saying, hey, where are the Tennesseans and the North Carolinians? And part of the reason why is the terrain, I think, is really, really, really important here. I'll turn it over to somebody else now.
Wayne, it's a really great point, and this is why it's great to walk the field. It's the micro terrain out here that makes all the difference. There's cover and concealment in the middle of this hill, and when we think about this attack, when we think about that we have Pettigrew and Trimble, as they come across the field, remember, they're coming out of the tree line and they're going straight across the field. 300-yard gap, and then Pickett's division. So there's even more distance on the other side. And then we're sitting here on a fence line, and appropriate that we are, because today on the battlefield there's about 2/3 of the fences that were here at the time of the battle. We know the way this works is when a regiment or a unit came up to a fence line, what we would do is we would just get our mass and we would just push the fence over. Now, yesterday, as we did the echelon attack from south to north, remember Rand's Wright's Georgians break through where we see the U.S. Regulars Monument. That's that obelisk there. So many of the fences to the south had been knocked down. But because the next part of that echelon attack doesn't go, many of these fences to the north are still intact. So every time that these units get to these fences, they have to slow down. And when we think about the Confederates coming across this field, they really have 4 problems. The first of which is artillery. We talked about it. If I take every Union battery that can target this field from the far side, here's what that looks like. Now you think each one of those batteries is made up of 6 guns. We're going to talk Union defense later on, but if you don't think Henry Hunt's a world-class artillerist, that's a world-class fire support plan. And every time these units get up to a fence line and they got to push it over, it's a little longer that they're under Union artillery fire. And as we come across the field, I think we're probably going to talk about it here in a minute, but where we see that little group of trees, that would have been the Bliss Farm. Would have been standing. It had been changed hands multiple times on July 2nd. Finally, about 11 o'clock on the morning of July 3rd, Alexander Hayes, that's his men setting up on the ridgeline just in front of us, will say, hey, we need to burn that thing down. So at this point, you know, imagine in all of the things we're trying to talk about, all of the smoke in this field, men marching, and when we think about them coming across the field, right, they're going to come out here at quick time, so 28-inch steps, 110 steps a minute as they come across here. Imagine the smudge and the burning of the farm now starting to drift with that 2 knots of wind from south to north, but it would have just added to the chaos of this field as we imagine men trying to cross it. Anybody else have something they want to add?
Doug, I've actually got a question for you, and Gary'd like us to keep walking as we chat here. So one of the things that is sometimes talked about in the Civil War is that maybe artillery is supposed to help knock down some fences. Are the infantrymen expecting that? Do you feel that that's part of the artillery plan or not so much here?
For Confederate artillery to knock down fences?
Right.
So that would have been a great removal of obstacle plan. I've never read anything about that.
So not happening here.
As Wayne went through the priorities, right, it's to tear that position limbless, which means all of these things are still intact.
Okay, very good. Thanks for clarifying for that. I've heard some people have different opinions on it, so it's good to get an expert perspective.
Speaking of different opinions, look at the comments, man. We got all sorts of things, but all things they agree on is that Doug is delivering cogent facts and Wayne Motts has a fangirl. So we got all sorts of cool stuff. You're with the American Battlefield Trust. We are walking the field of Pickett's charge. If we can't get to everybody being so generous with their time as well as their treasure, just know that we really appreciate your support. I did see one question in there I want to address. Somebody asked the normal time travel question, and what would you see? I'd love to see what you would do if you could had a time machine, what Gettysburg or other things you would go see. But this is more for Wayne. They said, you know, what was this field like at the time? Was it in grass? And we know what was growing in every field, but keep in mind, Wayne's going to tell us, I think, there was a lot of trumping going on here on July 2nd as well, Wayne.
Yeah, and I think Doug mentioned about the fencing and everything. You know, there are fences along the Emmitsburg Road. The fences on the northern part of this attack seem to be more intact than they are at the southern part of the attack. And the crops that are growing here are all trampled down. These fences end up as firewood. The crops end up getting trampled down. We've got wheat, corn, oats, rye. Those are the basic crops, clover grass, and we do have claims from the farmers out here as to what was growing in the different fields. so we know it. And I just want to say the only people that walk faster than Pickett's charge with Garry are the troops here on July, on July 3rd. You got to do a lot to keep up here.
Well, we're almost 40 minutes in
Kris,
here, guys. Let me add, somebody's apparently a fan of Timothy. Was Timothy growing out here? I don't know. They're wanting some
Iverson's
Timothy
guys
grass.
get shot down in a field of Timothy.
Yeah,
That's one we do.
There we go.
Well,
Well,
on the northern end of the battlefield. Yeah.
you should be happy here. So we are walking across the field of Pickett's charge, and we're approaching that halfway point. It seems like we've been walking for a while. We're not even halfway across yet. Now, at this point, what I would understand is that we are near the left center of the attack, or really near the left of the attack. On our left, I hope we would have some support from Brockenbrau's Virginians, the small, tiny brigade that fought on July 1st, and now here they are again on the 3rd, and they're not going to go that far, but we haven't even reached the line of where the rest of Pender's division is. You sort of have Mahone's Virginians behind us and Thomas's Georgians to our left. Wayne, what do you think about Lee not putting some of these less unfresh troops into the attack?
Well, as Doug just mentioned, I think that there's a lot of issues with the staff informing the commanding officer of what the condition of these troops are. He just mentioned earlier that there's a problem with, General Lee says a fact unknown to me, and he can't have any facts unknown to him as the chief of staff. But whether he knows, he certainly knows, I would think, that Pettigrew's brigade has taken some very heavy casualties, that Thomas, Posey, Mahone, that he's got some units that haven't taken as many casualties, but whether he gets a full report of that from his chief of staff or the staff officers, I'm not aware of any where anybody reported to him on these things. And it's clear there's things he does not know and then writes about it later. So I don't know, Doug, what do you think on that?
It's a really great point. Really, the only indication we have that Lee doesn't have the combat power that he thinks he has is after he rides south to talk to Longstreet this morning, about when the original plan is still unchanged and Lee has to come up with this new idea, is when he rides back amongst Hill's men and he sees many of the men bandaged from the first day's fight. And he says out loud, "We appear to be missing many of our friends this morning." It's the only indication that he doesn't have the combat power that he has. Hey, Kris, if I could stop right here for a second. I got a debate. I'd like to kick this around the group. Where does Robert E. Lee stand once this thing is launched? Now, everybody just points down to the Virginia Monument and go, of course that's where Robert E. Lee is, because that's where he sits on his horse Traveler today. And I think that's a terrible idea. I mean, this idea of where's a commander belong, and we would say, hey, at the point of greatest friction where you can make the most difference. Once 3 divisions leave that part of Lee's line, that's a sucking hole. There's nothing there for him to do. So I would argue Lee rides north. And if you can look, there's a little rise of ground. That's one of the highest points on Seminary Ridge, south of the seminary. He would have had a good view of the whole thing. Oh, by the way, if we think Longstreet's down towards Peach Orchard, it would have put Lee right behind the one division that A.P. Hill offers him. And remember, Lee says, no, General Hill, that would be my only reserve. And I would just push back on anybody who says that only reserve is in case this is a disaster. It's not. That only reserve is, once this punches through, Robert E. Lee is going to launch what is his last semi-fresh division, or at least a mixed one, to flow through this gap and now widen an opening and deepen this opening and exploit success. Anybody else? Where do we think Lee is?
Well, so first of all, we do know that he meets these troops coming back. So we know at the end of the attack he's over there. The question is he over there during a lot of this? And I don't think anybody knows all his locations.
It's true.
It certainly makes sense he's going to get to a position where he can see. We also should point out right behind where I'm standing, you've got the division of Robert Rhodes that fought on the first day's battle. You have other troops besides Rhodes, but they're in a place called Long Lane, which is right over where my shoulder is. And it's clear from the official records they were to cooperate. Now, we don't know, once again, there's a lack of coordination what the cooperation means, but they were to exploit any of this, move forward in attack. And on the evening of the 2nd and through the 2nd, we know there was heavy skirmishing up off to the right of your screen in what is now the Colt Park neighborhood of Gettysburg. So it could be that these men are going to be fearing the actual Union skirmishers that are up there. But Doug, I don't know. I think it's an interesting point. We know he's there in the return, but whether he's there or not in the return, that could be a different story.
Historical what if?
Yeah, well, what I'd like to point out is, here people might be watching and thinking, what? You got Kris, Sarah, Doug, Wayne, and Garry here. Don't you know where Robert E. Lee was standing? The answer is no. We are interpreters. We take the evidence that we, understand that they left behind, and we put it all together to come up with theories or sometimes with certainties about what was going on there. But let me just add one more thing. If Robert E. Lee was on that rise of ground, that house that's sitting next to there would be worth a whole lot more, I think.
Yeah, I wonder if there's anything to play into
Garry,
that.
I like to say, if everybody knew the answer, they wouldn't need us, right? I mean, we wouldn't be here. I mean, it's good that some of these things have
Maybe
to be
Wayne is saying that Doug is trying to keep us employed and is just throwing a wild accusation out there.
I like it already. I like it.
I just wanted to note that we are walking through the farm of William and Adeline Bliss. They purchased this farm in 1857. They had a large and commodious barn, a beautiful house with a library in it and cellar. And on July 1st, 1863, they and their two daughters will flee from this position. And over the next 2 days, there'll be heavy fighting, as Doug pointed out and Wayne pointed out. And on July 3rd, that farm will be burned to the ground. And Pettigrew's old brigade under Marshall will march right through it, the smoking ruins of it, as they go towards Pickett's charge. William and Adeline Bliss will put in a claim for more than $3,500 in damages, never be paid out by the U.S. government, and their neighbor, Nicholas Kaddouri, will purchase the land from them for $1,000, and they will move back to New York afterwards. Nicholas Kaddouri will have a sad and tragic end himself after the war. A local farmer gets caught in his own thresher, slices open his leg, and bleeds to death. So one of the things I think it's always important to point out that there are civilians out here. These are homesteads, and people are impacted by this war, not only 1,000 miles away in places like Mississippi and Louisiana, but they are impacted right here at the same time.
Kris, I think you ought to just take a look and maybe just swing around off to your right maybe and look at the piece of terrain that's right there in front of you. You can't see anything over on the back side of it. And then if you move a little to the left with your camera, you'll see right where that fence is. You can't, as Doug talked about, you can't see anything over on the other side of it either. So when you're walking down here, which is everybody needs to do, as we've said here, if you haven't done it, take a good look. And we're walking at a pretty good pace because we want to cover a lot of stuff, but take a good look around while you're walking down here.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. So it's these small intervisibility lines, these little areas of cover and concealment, and the soldiers will use these. And that's why when you come out here and you start to look at the terrain that way, you start to look at the field the way the soldiers did. Now, we talked about the Bliss Barn, and Garry talked about Brockenborough's brigade about the time, and we can have a debate of whether they make it past the Bliss Farm or they make it up to Long Lane. But facing almost 30 pieces of artillery up at Cemetery Hill, about here is when they stop. And now all of a sudden, this is the first indication that things are not going as entirely as we would expect. And now again, the right flank of this attack becomes open because we just peeled one brigade off.
And speaking of unexpected events and stopping, that's what we're going to do. The feed is lost. This will catch up eventually. We're going to pick up with another video. Thanks, Doug. Thanks, Wayne. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Kris. Thanks, National Civil War Museum. Thanks for watching. We'll be back. Hey everybody, Garry Adelman, American Battlefield Trust. We are back, and feel free to put that with an extended back into the comments if you'd like. You're with the American Battlefield Trust. We are on the field of Pickett's charge about halfway across, and we're going to continue the Confederate advance toward the Union line here. You might be able to see Seminary Ridge and even the Virginia Memorial with Robert E. Lee on top behind me over there. Let's reorient you here. As we go south along Seminary Ridge off in the distance, you're seeing more of the Confederate approach. Now we're getting into a view of Pickett's division during their attack in what we call Pickett's charge. And now you're looking across not only the field of Pickett's charge, but terrible fighting on July 2nd, 1863, as Georgians advanced across this field. As we move closer, you might catch the Kaddouri farm over there that Wayne Motts told us was a little bit smaller in terms of the barn. And now you're seeing Cemetery Ridge. The largest clump of trees over there is the clump of trees, the copse of trees. And now you're seeing the Bryan farm over there, a wartime structure rebuilt on that spot. And now you're seeing over toward the commercial district, but was still involved in the field of Pickett's charge, to be sure. We're now looking northward. If you could see past the trees, you'd see some of the town of Gettysburg. And as we move, finally, we're coming back to Seminary Ridge, the McMillan Rise over there, as well as where the North Carolina Monument would be, and now coming full circle. We're going to continue to walk toward the Union line off in the distance, and I think you're going to see from here that Cemetery Ridge is a little bit maybe more of a ridge than you would have thought. We hope you'll share this with your friends so as many people can experience this as possible. We've appreciated all your generosity along the way here. We got other people walking the field of Pickett's Charge here as we go toward the Rocky Top. Now, I'm going to ask Doug, Kris, Wayne, or Sarah, whoever wants to hop on, what would it have been like for the Confederates right about?
So I think it would have been horrific at this point. And when we think about all the microterrain, if we look off to our south, we can see we have a little bit of an intervisibility line. That would have protected us from, think about McGilvery's artillery line, south of where the Pennsylvania Monument is, or that big dome monument. So we get some protection, but you can see now we have nothing in front of us, no cover and concealment. We're entirely in the open. Of course, we've been following Pettigrew's division as he does this. We've mentioned that the Bliss Barn was burning. The problem also for the Confederates at this point is the Union can see the extent of this. We were talking about Brockenborough's brigade is the very northernmost brigade. About the time they either get to the Bliss Barn or Long Lane, facing 30-plus pieces of artillery firing off of Cemetery Hill. As Garry mentioned, they were fairly well beat up before they got here. They got beat up in McPherson's Woods on day one, and now here they find themselves on July 3rd. They're going to stop. Some people would say they would retreat, but either way, they don't keep going. So now it's Davis's brigade that is the very northern end, and our flank is exposed. So you can imagine for Union troops that are off to the north of us, this would be the 8th Ohio. They had been on the skirmishing lines, fighting over where we see Colt Park today, commanded by Colonel Franklin Sawyer. Because they all of a sudden now no longer have troops at their front, he would offer that they gave one volley into Brockenborough's brigade and then they left. They will start to wheel in our direction, and now they will start to shoot into the northern flank of this attack. So remember, when we think about this, this attack ain't going into a wall. I would argue it's going into the bottom of a box, and now it's being fired at from two sides. They will soon be joined, and we'll talk about this on a later walk, where we see the guy on top of the column. That's the Vermonters. They will wheel out from the south, and they're going to start to shoot in the southern flank of this. So now they're going to be shot at from three sides. You can imagine, so it's not just the artillery, but now they're feeling pressure on both of their flanks as they're trying to close on their objective that's directly in front of them. Anybody else want to add to that?
I just want to say, Doug, as we're getting closer up here to the Emmitsburg Road where we're all walking, this is when we're going to get the most infantry fire from the defensive line that's up along Cemetery Ridge. Most of this now that we've walked, it's going to be the artillery fire. The troops are going to be against artillery, and the artillery are taking out some large swaths of people as we're moving forward. These lines are getting shorter, shorter, and shorter as they're moving forward because of these artillery casualties. There are skirmishers out in front. They're going to get some bullet fire, but when we get up here on the Emmitsburg Road, this is where the Union Army is going to unleash this defense. And the way that the Emmitsburg Road goes, everybody, as it heads north, is it gets closer to that Union line along Cemetery Ridge. So when you're on the far left of this, you're a lot closer to the Union line than you are if you're over here in front of where the angle and copse of trees are that Kris is pointing the camera at right now.
And we're approaching, thanks Wayne, one of the most famous views of the Civil War here. But let me just pick up on something Wayne said. Wayne said these lines are getting shorter. For those of you who don't know, they are literally getting less wide. As a group of soldiers gets taken out, you close up to one side or the other. And to that extent, the lines literally shrink laterally as they approach the Emmitsburg Road. And I would say that, first of all, this road was different at the time of the battle. Gettysburg does have a sunken road, and this is one of them. Long Lane is a sunken road as well. And when you reach the comfort of a sunken road, looking at what Kris is showing you here, right across the way, sort of a little citadel in front of you, crowned by artillery, bristling muskets and bayonets, you know, it might have been very comfortable to stay in this road, right, Wayne?
Absolutely. And, you know, Garry, we can say that for certain. The question everybody has is, did people get out of this road? And I want to talk about this for a few minutes because I get tired of of hearing it. The Confederate soldiers come in and use this road for cover. Of course they do. This road was sunken during the time of the battle. It doesn't look like it does right now. So it is a natural avenue to cover. there's recent scholarship. People want to say, well, the majority of the Confederates didn't get out of this road and they didn't end up going forward here. And there are numerous pieces of evidence, I think, that will refute that. First of all, let's take a look at the Elliott burial map. The Elliott burial map has hundreds of graves, 522 of them right here, then another 106, and then more. The bodies that were buried here after Pickett's charge were buried on the west side of the road. I don't know any burial detail in the whole world that takes a body from the, or on the east side of the road, excuse me. I don't know a burial detail in the whole world that takes a body from the west side of the road, drags it across the road, and decides they're going to bury it right here. I think the majority of the Confederates that are killed or wounded in this assault are killed or wounded here east of the Emmitsburg Road, which is the side we're standing on right now from bullet fire. Look at the wounds. We can see what they are. It doesn't mean, folks, that some people did not leave the battlefield. It doesn't mean that some people didn't stay in the road, because they did, and we know they did. The question is it the majority? Is it most of the Confederates? And I just don't see it. I don't know how the other folks here feel about it. Chris, I don't know how you feel about it, but I just read this all the time, and I get tired of looking at it because I just think the evidence doesn't support it.
No, I agree with Wayne wholeheartedly. I mean, we have a Confederate, 3 Confederate divisions hitting a fixed fortified position. If you don't think this is a prepared position, you're crazy. Yes, there is a stone wall there, an existing stone wall, but portions of the line we'll walk in our next video were fortified. Some of the Union soldiers would say they were no higher than a molehill, but it is going to give them cover, concealment. It's a prepared position. Alexander Hayes, fighting Alec Hayes in command of a division in the Union 2nd Army Corps, has told all of his men to find those discarded muskets that are around you. They might have 1 musket, 2 muskets, 8 muskets loaded and laying right along that stone wall, waiting for these Confederates. And then, of course, what Doug talked about on our last video, and check that out, is Henry Hunt's artillery. He is going to slacken his artillery fire, which is going to lure in the Confederates to make this attack. And as they get closer and closer, he will then switch over to a short-range canister, which are iron golf ball-sized pieces of iron coming out of these guns, out of a coffee canister. So now we've gone from a bombardment to a barrage, setting up a wall of lead and iron that is coming across here. There's absolutely no doubt that Confederates stopped in this road, used it for cover and concealment, but there are men, and we know this, we have all the first-hand documents, who got up and moved forward. How many of those? That is to be debated, and we're going to check that out a little bit more later in this video and another video. But this is, sometimes some people might call it bravery, some people might call it stupidity to go into this, but what this is war, and war is the dumbest thing that humans can do to one another. But out here on the fields of Pickett's charge, this is going to bring everything together. Whenever we talk about the human drama, we see the mechanical with the artillery, and then we're going to see it all play out here on the fields of Pickett's charge, and that's why we come back here every year.
It becomes a really interesting point when we think about it, just even statistically speaking, as Chris and Wayne were talking about. Artillery will count for anywhere between 10 and 15% of casualties on Civil War battlefields. So it makes sense that they keep going, because based on the number of casualties, most of them would be by rifle fire. And today we would refer to the Emmitsburg Road as an informal fire support coordination measure, because if you're trying to command and control the 6,000 Union infantrymen that are there, everybody can see the Emmitsburg Road, and when we get there, that's when we're going to open fire. That's when we're going to transition to canister. Sarah brought up June Kimball earlier. June Kimball with the 14th Tennessee, as he crosses the road, will meet Theo Hartman, who will tap him on the shoulder and say, "I'm with you." And he says they make a compact that they will continue together. Soon they'll be joined by a guy named William McCullough, who says, "I'm with you also." He only goes 10 steps further before he gets shot in the head. But nonetheless, they would be advancing across these fields. And you can imagine, for all the high ground there is here in Gettysburg, as you look at the field in front of us, this does not seem all that steep. But to the advancing Confederates, it must have seemed like a mountain. And Union soldiers will talk about Confederates advancing hunched over with their hats pulled low, as if they were advancing into a storm. And of course it was. It was a storm of shot and shell.
Good. Wayne, you're with the American Battlefield Trust. Let's give a little pause here. We don't want to get to the end too quick, and we are resisting the urge to get too much into the Union response to all this. We're talking about it, but we're going to cover that on another video, as Chris referenced, after this. Now, a few people I want to mention here. Really happy to have Mike Lentz on here. He was one of our finalists in the Gettys Nerd quiz we held at the Adams County Historical Society a few days back. Look for that video in a few weeks as well. Aaron Rowland is on. Really happy to have you here as well. So look for another video coming up soon. Now, this is one thing I wanted to just pause before we get into this final moment. Wayne mentioned the Elliott burial map. We have a map sometimes very precise, sometimes less precise, but we know that this field was absolutely covered with dead. We know that field was as well. We've been walking over what were or are graves. When you're on battlefields, you know, battlefields are cemeteries. They were, and in many cases they still are. We expect that there are hundreds of remains still on this battlefield, and I think the government now believes, you know, what better place for them at this point. But, you know, it causes sort of a mix of reverence, you know, and, you know, as you see sometimes irreverence, because we're telling a story that even if obscene and terrible is, you know, thrilling in a lot of ways as well. So I just want to encourage people, when you come to battlefields, not everybody engages in the same manner, and I want to encourage y'all to mix that reverence and whatever other feelings you have when you come, because battlefields are different than other places. I think Kris wants to say something.
Yeah,
too.
soldiers from Caesar's legions all the way up to our war on terror, they have a dark sense of humor as well to get them through everything that happens out here. And we'll talk about some stories along the Union lines, including a man who uses a coffee pot as a weapon. So you're going to see a lot of different things out here, and this is a coping mechanism for many of them. But Doug was bringing us up into what is termed as a three-sided box out here to the north behind us. And if you look behind, you might be able to see the Eisenhower tree. That wasn't here in the 1860s, but placed here in the 1950s. And there's a monument or marker to the old Camp Colt training ground. But what's important is you can't see the stump of that tree, and you can't actually see up and over to Pickett's Buffet, which was purchased by the members of the American Battlefield Trust. Woo! That's where the 8th Ohio that Doug talked about coming up and swinging in and firing in this direction is firing from, but we can't see them. So how do we get support there? We have them from the east. That is going to be the main Union line, or the Union 2nd Army Corps, with reinforcements coming in. And then, of course, 1st Corps reinforcements swinging up in the form of 3 of the 5 brigades of the Vermont Regiment, the 2nd Vermont Brigade, I should say, swinging up here. They're sealing off either one of the flanks. And as we talked about, the Confederate line will be very extended when they start, but then keep compressing as they dress, they dress, they dress. That'll be through men who are falling back. Some of them are wounded. Some of them don't want to make this charge. Others will make it to the Emmitsburg Road and not push any farther. So as this line comes across, it's going to keep getting smaller and smaller. Think of a long rectangle, just slowly, like a Tetris piece, moving across here and just shrinking and shrinking, eventually entering inside of this box. And unfortunately for them, when they make contact here, it's that three-sided box. It's a wall of fire coming in from all sides. But what makes it worse if you're a Confederate and you look back across those fields, as Doug was pointing out in our last video, no one else is coming. There's no artillery support coming across here. There's no close infantry support. This is what most of Lee's assaults during the war lacks, a follow-up. This is something that will be talked about by his high command. We just came up too short. We were either attacking too late in the day, or we had a division or a corps too few. And that is what's happening out here at Gettysburg. I don't want you to think about one item. When Lee comes here north, he has to extend his supply lines from Richmond all the way up to Harrisburg at one point and then contract that line. And as he does so, that means he has to leave units behind. That means he is leaving cards on the table. Pickett's division has 5 brigades in it, but only 3 here at Gettysburg. That is half a division left behind. Part of Early's division is left behind as they make their way up through here. And a very churlish general named Daniel Harvey Hill, who doesn't like Robert E. Lee all that much, won't lend as many troops that were lent by Lee back to the Army of Northern Virginia. The Confederates left something like 8,000 men on the table as they marched north. That is one full division here. And I'm not playing the what-if game, but think about if he had 8,000 more men in support, what he could have had here at Gettysburg. Would they have been played out on July 1st, 2nd, or 3rd? We don't know that. But we do know for a fact the Confederates left cards on the table in Virginia and what is today modern-day West Virginia.
Thanks, Kris. I got 3 things, one in response to that. The first thing is, one thing is that Lee tried to put strength in the middle, or at least Longstreet did. He didn't really put a lot of strength on the flanks. There was supposed to be. Armistead is behind Garnett and Kemper, and you have this power. But, a capable opponent is going to also shift troops while you are. This is why at many battlefields there isn't that follow-up punch, because your opponent is thinking the same thing and wanting reinforcements to the critical point. 2, I want to do a 360, then I have a question for Wayne. So, Sarah behind the camera, you're looking out toward the scene of Pickett's division's attack, and then we're going to cross by the Cadore buildings over there, where General Pickett probably reached during the field of attack at Pickett's charge. You're seeing the round tops over there, and you're seeing some really varying terrain between here and the round tops. Then you're catching some of the Union monuments. We're going to cover those a little bit more when we get over there. And then you're seeing the famous clump of trees. This lone tree here is what we call the angle. We'll talk about that area around there as well. And then this is the rest of Cemetery Ridge over here. So Kris already showed you some of this. Now, as we start to walk again, Wayne, I just want to pick up on something you said. So not everybody came past the sunken Emmitsburg Road, right? But when they did advance from there, were they in clumps? Were they in organized lines? What's your impression?
Yeah, and you took the words right out of my mouth. I was going to try to jump in. You know, we're talking about organized lines as we head toward the Emmitsburg Road. These lines are getting shorter, shorter, and shorter from the casualties. But once the troops cross the Emmitsburg Road, the semblance of order really melts away, and it's very difficult for the Confederates to keep any sense of a combat line here because the troops are clumped together. Armstead is coming up behind as the Virginians. You've got Trimble's 2 brigades that are coming up behind. They started out behind, and Armstead started out behind. They're catching up, and now we've got troops that are leaving the battlefield, some of them wounded and otherwise, and the other troops coming up in front of that. So we've got to say, Gary, when they cross the road, what we're walking here, it's very difficult to keep a sense of order. And you want this to be a bayonet assault. These troops have fixed bayonets. You don't want them to stop and fire, because if they stop and fire, the Union Army is going to be taking out large clumps of men. You're going to take out the momentum of this assault. This is supposed to be a bayonet assault, so you want to get everybody to move forward, but your natural inclination, if you don't have a commanding officer over here, is to stop and open fire. And that's what some of these troops are doing, stopping part of this momentum. Some of these soldiers, we should say, also are mounted. Richard Garnett is mounted. Pettigrew was mounted and wounded. Trimble is mounted and wounded. Lee had given orders the men weren't to mount, but they know getting off the horse, they really can't command because their ability to move around is very limited. You get off that horse, you're only commanding what's immediately in front of you, but then what a huge risk you're going to take being mounted. And many of these commanders here pay a heavy price for being mounted here in the assault.
Indeed, Wayne, and let me just say, and thanks for that. You know, here we have 5 people that have a lot to say about Pickett's charge, and note that we have been walking this field on the Confederate line, Union line, and in between for a solid 6 years, or 7 maybe, live and not live during this anniversary. We encourage you to go back and see our other anniversary coverage. We encourage you to watch our War Department videos, because we can't possibly cover the thousands of Confederate soldiers who moved beyond the road. We can't possibly cover the hundreds of stories we have about these soldiers, and this doesn't even include all of the Union stuff that we are working on at this point. So we really want to encourage you to. Now, I want to talk to Doug here and see what he has to say, because here we are approaching sort of the William Faulkner moment here, right? For every Southern boy, there's still hope right here. So we're not going to enter the Union line here. We're going to end up here near the angle. But what is this moment like for you, Doug?
Yeah, so I thought the idea of the disintegration, right? Most of war is about cohesion and disintegration. The disintegration of these Confederates' lines as they come across. And remember, we call it Pickett's charge or Longstreet's assault, but remember, nobody charges across the field. They march across the field. You couldn't have them run. First guy would get here in 15 minutes. The last guy, you know, the guy you call when you're moving your refrigerator, he wouldn't get there for another 30. We got these guys, they all show up at the same time with one concerted fist to break through this line. So as Wayne was talking about, anywhere from about 100 yards down to about 50 yards, many of these Confederates will level their rifles and deliver a volley, and then for the first time you'd hear it, the rebel yell. Now it's Pickett's charge. Now men will start at a rush to slam into this Union line. Now it is truly the culmination of all of the artillery fire. This movement, the coordination of Pickett and Trimble and Pettigrew to get to this point to now have this concerted fish will now slam into the Union line.
Well, who wants to claim the mic? Here we are coming up to our goal here to bring this up. We don't want to talk about what's going to happen when they cross the wall, but I don't know. I guess I'd be curious about numbers here. I mean, we've got all of Pettigrew and any of Trimble's guys that are going to make it this far here on the left. I place, only, I don't place 2,000 or 3,000 actually coming right up to this wall. What are your impressions here? What kind of a punch does the Confederate attack have at this point?
So this becomes a really great question, and it's one we can't ever know. Wayne was talking about the burial maps. So even if we say, hey, they knock out 20%, if we say roughly 12,500, that's usually 8,000 come across the road. So we think 8,000 cross the road, and then the infantry open fire. I don't know. How many guys do they actually shoot down? If you go 15% of all the guys in the infantry line are the real killers of that 8,000, that means more than 5,000 guys get up here. And if you think about that, there's 6,000 here, but they've been under the artillery bombardment. They've been getting pounded for the last hour. All of those guys, I put the number as higher. I think that more people arrive here, and oh, by the way, the battle flags tell us that's true too, because guys are going to follow their battle flags. And this is both the brilliance and the tragedy of how they did recruiting back then. We would all been recruited from the same small town, and once one of us decides to go, we all have to go, because if you don't, you can never go back home. And as long as that guy from your town goes forward, you're going forward too. And this is why the losses are so tragic. And the other thing we could say is after 2 years of war, now all the narrow-shouldered people are gone. They all know in both armies, how do you win? Stay another minute, advance another 2 minutes, stay after it another 5. And because they do, the casualties on this battlefield are through the roof. So I have it as more, but that's open to debate.
I think you're right. There's a reason why you bring him out here, Gary. You know, he couldn't have said it better. I don't think. I think he's right. I think you've got 8,000 or 9,000 get to the road. That's my thought. Think about what's taken out in the cannonade. You've got some people that are down because of the heat. And folks, we're walking the battlefield when there's a great breeze out here on July 3rd, 161 years ago. It didn't look like that. One of our colleagues is working on the weather. So we know at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on the 3rd, it was some 87 degrees. And then the field temperature is over 100. And we're out here in short sleeves and everything else. And we know the troops were lost also because they were down with the heat. But I think the majority of them got out of that road. I think they got up into the field, and then they got driven back to the road for cover if they were not killed or wounded. That's my opinion. And then you've got some crossing the wall here, and you've got breakthroughs at 2 other points south of where we're at too as well. Let's remember that. North of us, you've got troops coming right up to where the Union line is located, but you don't really have a breakthrough. And one last thing I want to say too, Gary, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about it at some other time, but we ought to do a whole video on it, in my opinion, is the combat stress, the combat trauma, the mental anguish of these troops that are here. I can't stress to all the viewers enough what Pickett's charge does to these troops mentally. Forget about whether they're physically injured. We know that PTSD happened. Some troops could not come back and walk this attack because of what they saw, the trauma witnessed. And this is just one battlefield. That's all a cumulative trauma. And we can't put into words what Pickett's charge did to the people that survived it. And whether or not they had a physical wound or not, everyone is coming out of here with a mental scar. And back in those days, they don't have the mental health professionals we have today. The military has special people dedicated to deal with this type of military trauma, and I can't stress to the viewers enough, in my opinion, tremendous amount of mental anguish and trauma from this assault here and in other places on Civil War battlefields.
Thanks, Wayne. I think we're going to leave it there unless anybody else is calling up for it. So we have brought the Confederates in 2 videos across the field. By the way, we've been shooting videos for the last few days here. We've been launching them at other times as well. We got a really special one coming up of a famous photograph on July 2nd. So make sure you're checking out our other coverage and catching up. But we've brought the Confederates up here. We're going to do our best to have another video before too long on the Union line and really bring Pickett's charge to a close here. I can't thank Wayne Motts enough. You know, he works with the Gettysburg Foundation, and this is a busy week for the Gettysburg Foundation. That he's spending time with us is just great. We appreciate it. Douds, licensed battlefield guide, and a million other things joining us with their time. And let me tell you, I get a lot of undue credit for these videos that Kris and Sarah and other people are doing a whole lot more. Andy behind the scenes, making things run, deleting the bots and everything like that. So I can't thank everybody involved enough. And you for watching, for supporting battlefield education and preservation, for sharing this with your friends, and for most importantly, helping to perpetuate the story of our great country. Here we are again. It's Gettysburg 161, and I confess your American Battlefield Trust team is getting tired as we are overlooking the field of Pickett's charge to talk about probably the most famous event in Gettysburg, or some say the most famous attack in American history, Pickett's charge, the Pickett-Pettigrew-Trumbull assault, and the associated Union response that we're going to be focusing on here. You're with the American Battlefield Trust. I'm Garry Adelman. That's Kris White behind the camera. We got Sarah Kay Bierle and a couple of guests you'll hear from almost immediately. So here we are. We're going to kick things off, orient you, and get you going, and we're going to do that with Sarah Kay Bierle. Take it away.
Thanks, Gary. Yes, we're standing here on what was the Union line for a good portion of the Battle of Gettysburg. So let's just set this in context in the general timeline of the battle, and then we'll turn around and show you the landscape that we've got here in the area. So the Battle of Gettysburg, fighting happens here from July 1st through the 3rd. In this video, we're going to be talking a lot about the fighting that happens on July 3rd. If you want to hear about the fighting on the 1st and the 2nd, check out our other videos. Some of the fields that we're going to be overlooking here as we turn around in a moment, there was fighting that happened out there on the 2nd as well, and you can see that in some of the videos that we've shared previously. So when we get to July 3rd, what's been happening is the Union has set up a defensive position that looks in the shape of a fishhook. It's running from Culp's Hill to Cemetery Hill, along Cemetery Ridge, down to Little Round Top and Big Round Top. And we're going to show you those locations. We're turning here. You can see back behind me, or in the view of your camera, you're looking toward the south, toward the peach orchard, the wheat field. You can't see Devil's Den. You're probably catching a view of Little Round Top and Big Round Top. And as we keep turning around, you're going to see Cemetery Ridge here behind me. And as we continue turning, you're going to start to see the direction of Culp's Hill. And as we turn looking north, you're looking along Cemetery Ridge. You may be able to see a lot of monuments here off to my left, and a roadway here. Roadway not here at the time of the battle, monuments not here at the time of the battle, but helping to show this position of Cemetery Ridge, a key portion of the Union line. Now in the fighting on July 2nd, Confederates have attacked the flanks, the sides of the Union position. Lee is hoping that the center of the Union line has been weakened. As Union reinforcements are sent into the fighting on the flanks, this makes Lee hopeful that perhaps the center of the Union line is weak. So he is going to plan a large attack, a march across these open fields to strike at the center of the Union line. And as Gary was mentioning, this is what is called Pickett's charge, the Pickett-Pettigrew-Trimble charge, Longstreet's assault. It takes on a lot of different names, most popularly called Pickett's charge. This is going to open in the afternoon of July 3rd and send thousands of Confederate troops toward the center of the Union line. Holding this line, you have troops from the Union 2nd Corps, which is commanded by Winfield Scott Hancock. And I think Gary, our special guests, are going to help us get down into the stories of some of those brigades, those regiments, helping to hold this line as these Confederate infantrymen are coming across the field in the wake of a very large, terrific firing of artillery that has taken place previous to that infantry attack. Doug, do you want to come on and start setting it into the lower level for us?
Thanks, Sarah. So remember, we talk about the Confederate bombardment will last anywhere from an hour, at most from beginning to end 2 hours. For Union troops, you can imagine on this field, we're standing somewhere near ground zero getting pounded by 300 shells a minute. When the Confederate advance comes, imagine as the smoke slowly starts to rise across the field and the men are awe-inspired by a mile-long battle line dotted by 42 blood-red battle flags. They start to use language like an unstoppable machine, a rising tide, an incoming wave. Now, Union artillery will start to whittle this attack down, so this Confederate advance is shrinking. In fact, we can imagine Pickett's division is sliding to our right because they're going to try and join up with Trimble and Pettigrew. So as they move to the right, effectively for some of the Union troops in the position where we are, which are going to be Vermont troops. These are 9-month troops raised in response to the Antietam campaign. They're in the defenses of Washington. They have anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks left on time of service. They're members of the 1st Corps, but they're in the center position during July 3rd. As this Confederate attack starts to drift off to our north, we are uncovered. Winfield Scott Hancock will ride to the south, sensing an opportunity, and talk to the brigadier, General Stannard. And what they're going to do is he's going to offer that they should wheel out, and it's about this time that Winfield Scott Hancock is wounded. The bullet will pass through the pommel of his horse, carry the round and a nail into the wound, a grievous wound. It'll happen, well, arguably, if we go by the monument, it happens right down there. As he falls from the horse, he's captured by 2nd Lieutenant George Benedict of the 12th Vermont, keeps him from hitting the ground. He's an aide in the 12th Vermont. Later on in the day, as Hancock gives this order, the Vermonters have already started. The 13th and 16th Vermont are going to start to wheel out from this position. And as we've mentioned on other videos, the Pickett's charge, this attacking into a wall, it's attacking into a three-sided box. And as these Union soldiers wheel out, they're going to start to shoot into the southern flank of this attack. We're going to follow their position where they get to, because it's about 200 yards to the north of this part. Now, I bring up Benedict because later on in the day, when Longstreet finally relents and will send reinforcements, men from Florida and Alabama, they'll drift across the field just to the south of us. Nobody told them that they had been angling to the north. That's that lack of proper coordination. What's going to happen is Benedict will be sent out here to take these two Vermont regiments. They will wheel, do 180 degree, and they'll fire into the flank of that. And for that action, Lieutenant Benedict will be awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions on July 3rd, 1863. Now with that, we should probably start heading to the north. As we turn around, we see Lieutenant Stephen Brown, a member of the Vermont Brigade. On the march up here, his men are, in order to make speed, they're told not to fill their canteens with water. His men will all be dying of thirst as they march this way. They'll come across a well and he'll see two guards next to it. He'll tell them to beat it because he's going to have his men fill their canteens. They give him the standard, Lieutenant, you can't do that. And so ultimately he will have his men fill their canteens, but he'll be arrested. Now remember, if you're an officer and you get arrested during the Civil War, they're going to take your horse, they're going to take your sword, you're going to march behind your men and eat the dirt of their marching, all part of the indignity. Now, by the time they arrive here, they go, look, we need Brown, he's a good officer, that's kind of a, that was a kind of a humbug order there, and they agree. So if you take a look, though, it is the Army of the Potomac, and they can't find his horse, and they can't find his sword. So if you look under his right foot, you'll see a camp axe, because that's what he uses as his symbol of command on July 3rd. And you go, no, wait. I can see he's holding a sword in his hand. But if you take a close look, that sword isn't connected to his belt. That is a sword that he is going to capture from a Confederate during Pickett's charge. So if you don't think those soldiers had a sense of humor, imagine putting a second lieutenant up on your monument so that you could tell that whole story in that one little snapshot. Now we're moving north and we're starting to move into John Gibbon's line. Wayne, do you want to talk a little bit about Gibbon?
I do. We're right next to one of the witness trees here for where Gibbon, and Gibbon was probably wounded, I should say, wounded in the shoulder right near where this tree is, and they've tried to put cement in it and save it over the years that it's been here. But what a fascinating history if this tree could talk. Now, John Gibbon, as we move up and head north, we just left the Vermonters, which are part of the 1st Union Army Corps, and now we're into the 2nd Union Army Corps, and John Gibbon is going to be the commanding officer of the 2nd Division of the 2nd Union Army Corps, and he's born in Holmesburg, which is a suburb of Philadelphia, and then his family moves down to North Carolina, and he's got brothers in Confederate regiments here in the Battle of Gettysburg. Robert Griffin, who's a surgeon, and he's got another brother named Nicholas, and these men were officers in the 28th North Carolina Regiment. And after the war, of course, trying to repair this family is going to be a difficult thing. Gibbon retires as a military officer. He's in the relief column at Little Bighorn and picks up the pieces related to George Armstrong Custer, and then he dies in 1896, and he's buried at Arlington National Cemetery out in front of Robert E. Lee's house. We're walking along the defensive line for the Union Army for Hall and Harrow's Brigade here for July 3rd, 1863. And we're in an original avenue which no longer exists where Kris is filming right now. So, Gary, do you want to mention some of that? Because you're the photography guy.
Of course I do. We might not. Thanks so much, Wayne. We're so lucky to have Wayne and Doug and Team Trust out here on a beautiful day. The soldiers would have loved if it was like this today with a nice breeze out on the field of Pickett's Charge. You see a lot of people enjoying this place, and we're so happy y'all are with us here. We see a bunch of you joining, and we see you joining from a bunch of different places. I won't go into that right now, but we are walking on one of the many battlefield avenues that was conceived, constructed, and then removed. There were a lot of these avenues where when cars were going 8-10 miles an hour, you could have curves and have them access all sorts of points. Eventually, things changed a little bit, and no longer did you really want roads to every access point on the battlefield, and I think we're better off for it. But once in a while, you see a monument or something facing in a screwy way, and that might be why. I can't recall if we're where this path we're taking is. I need Doug's help.
Yeah, we're going to hop right up here. Hey, I just want to point out 20th Massachusetts. 20th Massachusetts, while we're here, is commanded by
Paul J. Revere.
Paul J. Revere. So his grandfather was obviously Paul Revere, coppersmith. He's not here, but his grandson is. He's commanding 20th Massachusetts. 20th Massachusetts, storied regiment. Like I said, we've all been recruited from the same small town, and they were known as the Harvard Regiment. Of the 579 men who served in Harvard during the war, 9 Harvard grads are killed in the 20th Massachusetts. When we think about nearly the 2,500 units that the federal government raises to fight the American Civil War, the 20th Massachusetts suffers the 5th most casualties. On July 2nd, when we talk about Rands, Wrights, Georgians coming around the big barn and they hit the Union line and they break through here. So in the evening, about 7:15, Lieutenant Colonel Paul Revere is mortally wounded. So he's not here on July 3rd. But of course, the regiment's still in place. One of their newest lieutenants is Lieutenant Sumner Payne. His great-grandfather was Robert Treat Payne, signer of the Declaration of Independence. And if you go, holy cow, this Harvard graduate is here? Yes, they were stewards of this great experiment that had been handed to them by their grandparents.
I'm going to bust in real quick here because we have some friends up there waiting for us, so we could take this trail. I think we should see them first and then try to walk out in reverse a little bit. Is that cool?
Sounds great. Absolutely.
Sorry, Doug.
No. So on July 3rd, during Pickett's charge, it will be Robert Treat Payne, who had dropped out of Harvard, excellent student, was there with ease, knew he was missing the war, knew this was the test of manhood for his generation. And so he joins with the unit. In fact, he joined in Chancellorsville, and now he's here as a company commander. He gets shot in the leg. As he's pointing off to the north to send the regiment in that direction, he's shot and killed. So he is killed here, another member of those 20th Massachusetts, and we see that 18-ton pudding stone, state stone of Massachusetts. If we want to tie that back to his great-grandfather's time, pudding stone is a state stone of Massachusetts, and we think Old North Church, 1 if by land, 2 if by sea, sits on a foundation of pudding stone. And that used to sit in the playground in Roxbury, Massachusetts. And they didn't tell us why they used it, but you can imagine maybe they remembered a more innocent time, or perhaps it was that future generations wouldn't spend their innocence on these battlefields. So we're going to come up and we're going to meet some more of these regiments here. Up here we have the 42nd New York, sponsored by Tammany Society. So it's a good do-gooder society. They sponsored the regiment, and I think we have a good artifact up here that might tell us a little bit about some of the men who are here.
Sure, I have a cased tin type of Neil McLean, also spelled on the record as Neil McLearn. He was a 24-year-old in full uniform at the time of enlistment, May 1861. 2 years, a month, and a week later, his regiment found themselves here in this position behind me. And this gentleman was killed outright. He was one of 15 men from the regiment to be killed.
It's one thing, again, I can't thank you enough, Dane, Mike from the National Civil War Museum, to see the faces of those who were killed. There's something about it, especially in this original image. That piece of tin, that hand-colored piece of tin, hand-tinted, that was with him when he took this picture, and now we're learning of his demise. So I think Kris might want to add something.
Yeah, Gary, if you don't mind holding the mic. So me from behind the camera. Over here, as Gary's pointed out, this has been tinted, so there is some colorization here. If we get a little bit closer, he's definitely carrying a smoothbore musket. We can tell that by the different bands, even around where his hand is sitting. A bandana fixed, and of course it has his breastplate over top of a shell jacket that is partially unbuttoned. Military regulations at the time, all you needed to have was your top button, so he's not doing his military regulations, but it's a great forge cap, and you can see his cartridge box over here on the side, as well as his cap pouch. So really great image here, and in the case itself that's in is just absolutely exquisite.
Yeah, thanks, Kris. Thanks, Dane. I think unconfirmed reports suggest we're about to see you again before too long. Now, before I turn this over to Wayne Motts, we're going to double back a little bit here. But before I turn it over, let me just say that, the way that they dressed, think about how personal that is to you, okay? The way that they wore what they were issued is personal to them, and somehow seeing a picture really brings it home a little bit, whether you survived or did not survive a particular battle or the war. I just wanted to mention that. Wayne?
Yeah, I want to, as we walk down here, and we're going to get out in front or on the west side of where this line for the Union Defense for the 2nd Corps is located, and we want to step out into here because we're going to go down here to where James Lawson Kemper was wounded. General Pickett had 3 brigade commanders here in the Battle of Gettysburg: Lewis Armstead, of course, Richard Garnett, and James Lawson Kemper. And 2 of those men will not survive the attack for July 3rd. Armstead will die on July 5th. Garnett will be killed in action on the 3rd. And Kemper will be the only one of these 3 brigadiers that survive. He's 40 years old here at the time of the battle, and he probably goes down. The great thing about Kemper is, if we can call that great, is we've got his account. Because he survives, we've got something that he talks about, and he probably goes down right along where this fence line is. Kris, if you want to, we'll come out here, kind of move that camera around. You can see this little hill that's right here that gives us some kind of cover. There's a monument here to the 13th Vermont, of course, where the Vermonters came up. But this area in here where we call the slashing, there's rocks that are here. It gives these troops a little bit of cover when you're standing down here. And on July 2nd and on the 3rd, this is the area where Wright's brigade came up on the 2nd day. Georgians here in the battle. But Kemper is probably wounded severely. He's shot in the groin. He suffers a very, very bad wound right along this fence line here. And he says and he can actually make out the features of the people that shot him. Now, the account says that Confederate soldiers run over and try to grab him in a blanket. They put him on a blanket, they try to lift him up, and because of the infantry fire, they drop him. So I can't imagine the pain, the agony this poor guy is in. The Union Army soldiers try to come out, but they don't get him, thank heavens for him, and then he's taken back and goes over toward where the Union line is. He's held as a prisoner of war, later on held here, but recovers from this wound to survive the Civil War, the only one of Pickett's brigadiers that does here for July 3rd.
That's awesome.
Doug?
Hey, one of the reasons, again, to come walk this ground is, you know, when we get down here, all the way at this little low spot, you can barely see the top of some of those Union monuments. This is cover, meaning you can't be shot, and concealed, meaning people can't see you. So I think Douds crosses this field and then says, this is a good place for me. Now, when we imagine that the Vermonters wheel out and attack from the south, we've moved from where the standard is up on the column monument. When they wheel out, we're in about the position where they get. So not only are they shooting into the southern flank, they're also flushing the Confederates out from behind these covered and concealed positions. And this is a place where, look, if you look at a topographical map, this will never show up. But if you walk the ground, you go, oh, now I get it. I understand why they've come out here, not only putting pressure on their flank, forcing the Confederates to turn 2 of their regiments to the south, but they're also going to flush the Confederates out of this concealed ground. Let's keep on walking up this way. You can imagine now as Pickett's division is sliding off to our north and we are looking into the Union position. We can see the copse of trees, or the group of trees, largely our visual aim point for this attack. You can imagine now, look, even as we see high ground right in front of us, again, we have some cover and concealment here as we start to approach the Union line. Wayne talked about the slashing. We're about to walk through what is known as the gate. Brown's battery would go through the gate, which is effectively a hole in the wall, to come out here on July 2nd to support the 2nd Corps' efforts that were ultimately trying to help Dan Sickles stay in position, the very northern end of their line around the Cadore Barn. As we enter into the Union line, you can imagine the 69th Pennsylvania, just off to our left, commanded by Colonel O'Kane. Philadelphia Regiment, they carry the national colors and, of course, the emerald green flag of Ireland. His orders today are, don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. He's the only one to have all 10 companies marked. When the Confederate line slams into this Union position, the 69th Pennsylvania will refuse 3 companies on each side of them. And it will be in about this position where the Confederates will break through, one of the breakthroughs. Now, one of the conditions for which Edward Porter Alexander will send a note to Pickett would be to say he sees a battery on the southern side of this copse of trees that would be removed. And as they're removed, he says, come quick if you're going to come at all, they're removing batteries. Well, it has since been replaced with a 6-gun battery of Cowans, all double-shotted with canister. You can imagine when these Confederates break through, those 6 cannon go off, and you can imagine they turn this into a giant red cloud. But the 69th Pennsylvania would be fighting in this position as the Confederates slam into this angle.
Let me just say, there's just so many comments I can't keep up. But suffice to say, Doug might have more energy than Garry. It might be true. And yes, if you're a great-grandchild of George Sears Green, we're always happy to shout you out here. We have at least 10, 12 videos that reference George Sears Green. So your great-grandparent is well referenced here. I just can't even keep up with everything, but we're glad you're enjoying it. With the American Battlefield Trust, we're approaching the angle on Cemetery Ridge here with our special guest, Wayne Motts and Doug Douds. We got Sarah, we got Kris White behind the camera. Wayne, I think you have something here you want to talk about.
Yeah, I just think it's one of the interesting things, and I think, Garry, you've covered it on other videos in the past, is we've had a lot of monuments moved here on the fields, not just in Pickett's Charge, but elsewhere. And the earliest memorials that were placed here, at least by the states, were the state of Massachusetts. They put up some of the earliest monuments. And there's an actual photograph taken along here where Kris is videoing us on Harrow Avenue of the 20th Massachusetts monument. And if you know where to look, you can see the original position of where the 20th Massachusetts Memorial was, and it was right here. So that pudding rock that Doug just referenced, its original location was right here, and the monument to the 15th Mass was right over behind where the viewers are. And you can line up some of the old images, and you look in the background and you see the Cadore farm, and you can't figure out, well, how did that get that way? That's because the monument has been relocated. I think the Pennsylvanians and New Yorkers didn't like the fact that the Massachusetts, Garry, got here first.
Yeah, maybe, and I think, I'm gonna have to up the energy a little bit if Doug's catching up to me or whatever. I just want to say Alicia Boggs is having trouble working because of us and all of our videos. That's exactly what we want to happen. We don't want you to lose your job. We want you to be able to support battlefield preservation. But she also asked if they cleaned up the clump of trees recently. Yes, the Park Service has cleaned up a lot of the brush that used to be there. And let me just say that we went there a year ago. Wayne, Kris, and the National Park Service, we went inside the clump of trees. Check out that video from Gettysburg 160.
Yeah, and I just wanted to tip into what both Doug and Wayne were talking about with monuments and the changes of this battlefield. You can check out more last year on our 160 video here in the high water mark, but this area at one point was a United States military encampment during 1917 and 1918. In fact, where we were with Doug down in his cover and concealment area, that was actually a large swimming pool that was installed there in 1917 for the Camp of the United States Troops, later known as Camp Colt. We'll also have changes up here whenever we have the 1922 reenactment for the Marines. We have the 1913 and 1938 reunions, but we also have roads that are installed. If you look over here towards the 71st and 72nd Pennsylvania monuments, you might notice a little shelf of ground, and I'll put a picture up here in a moment of Old Webb Avenue. And some of us have driven on Old Webb Avenue that would take you around the guns of Alonzo Cushing, who I'm sure we'll speak about here in a few minutes, as well as the marker to Lewis Armistead, who was felled in that region. So this battlefield's going to change over the years for a variety of reasons, and the interpretation, as we call it, as well as visitor access. And the best example of that recently was just the reopening of Little Round Top, which was so well loved by all of us that it had to be shut down, refurbished, and brought back to life, and just reopened about a week ago.
All right, so if we think about this attack now, we have the 69th Pennsylvania is bent back on both sides. The 72nd Pennsylvania, the club muskets, a wonderful monument. Of course, they're not there. They're back by the road, and there's no road there in 1863. The 71st Pennsylvania, when the Confederates get about 100 yards away, deliver a volley, and then we hear the rebel yell, they will break and run back to the road. And then we know the second line of Confederates arrive here. Lewis Armistead's brigade in Pickett's division will arrive and say, we can't stay here. Let's give them the cold steel, boys. Home is over the hill. He's going to lead them around the end of the 69th Pennsylvania, and then they're into the Union line. Now, once they break in, though, the Union are starting to reply. We just passed a bunch of regiments, 42nd New York, 19th Massachusetts, that will counterattack through these copse of trees. In fact, Major Edmund Rice, fantastic individual, a leader in the supporting Colonel Devereaux, will lead part of the element of the 19th Massachusetts through there. Their flag bearer that day, Corporal Joseph DeCastro, will find the flag bearer of the 14th Virginia, beat him with the flagstaff, steal the 14th Virginia battle flag, go hand it to Colonel Devereaux, go get back in the line, and he becomes the first Hispanic American ever to be awarded the Medal of Honor. Edmund Rice will also be awarded the Medal of Honor. And a fascinating guy. By the Wilderness, he's in command of the 19th Massachusetts. He gets wounded, captured at Spotsylvania, sent back to Virginia on a train. He hops off of a moving train. 23 days later, shows up in Ohio, rejoins the Army to the end of the war, becomes the military attaché to England, to Russia, and ultimately to Japan. One of those heroes defending the Union Center here on the afternoon of July 3rd.
Yeah, I just wanted to tip in, Doug. That was a great retelling. The cover of the book for my one of my alma maters, Norwich, is a Dale Gallen painting showing the fight of DeCastro with that flag bearer of the 14th Virginia, and it was called By the Blood of Our Alumni, and it tells some of the stories of the men who came through there. Also, I'd like to point out, as Gary's trying to take the microphone away from me, it looks like, that there are a lot of different small unit actions down here, but it's all about decisions and how quickly you can make a decision. And I like that what Winfield Scott Hancock said to Arthur Devereux, the 19th Massachusetts, and he looked at, Devereux asked Hancock, should I get in there? And he looked at the colonel and said, you better get in there pretty goddamn quick. And that was it. That was the order, and he came charging through there with the 19th.
Hey, Kris, we're getting all profane up here in the angle, but war is terrible here. Let me just see, before we go see our friends, remember Doug and Wayne were talking about the 72nd Pennsylvania, the 69th. Well, they are in a brigade commanded by a guy you see over there, Alexander Stewart Webb. Remember, there are cannons up here under the command of Alonzo Cushing, they already mentioned a little bit. And let's get a little bit up close with some of the objects from this, because I think you're really going to actually enjoy this. Again, this is Dane from the National Civil War Museum, assisted by Mike, who is been called Fred Durst, but I'm sure it's not him. So, Dane, what do you got?
We have a cased ambrotype of William W. Clark, who enlisted at age 27, a native of Philadelphia, in the Company A of the 72nd Pennsylvania. And he was another individual killed here on the third day of the battle, outright. Very, very interesting image. Hatless in this image, also has the musket and bayonet connected to it. It's a great piece as well. And then over here, we have the very prime piece, Alonzo H. Cushing's officer's belt. And we'll allow Kris to get a nice close-up of that. All original leather. Not polished too often, probably in its lifetime.
Wayne, sorry, I took it off you. I'll let you speak here, but this is a beautiful piece. This is what Alonzo Cushing was wearing when he was killed here at Gettysburg. This is an officer's belt with the sword hangers here off the side. You can see the Federal Eagle belt plate, and you can also see his initials, AH, and then, of course, his last name, Cushing. Sorry, Wayne, there you go.
No, I just wanted to say, we've got a picture probably of Cushing in this belt. There's one taken of me and Tatum that matches pretty much what this belt is. And if you look up here at the top, we've always wondered about these dark stains on that belt, whether because he was wounded, of course, down in the bottom part of his body, right up near where his waist was. One of his wounds, he got wounded in the shoulder, he got wounded in the groin, he had multiple wounds, and then the fatal wound that went through his head. But it makes you wonder what's actually on that belt. And it looks like this picture that's at the Library of Congress, which you can go to Library of Congress and download and blow it up or enlarge it as Gary would do. It's probably this belt that he's actually wearing in that image, which is pretty fascinating.
This is such a special moment brought to us from the National Civil War Museum in Harrisburg that I want to invite any of our other guests who have anything else to offer about this. This idea of here you have an object that was here with somebody whose picture we have, who was awarded the Medal of Honor very much later, about bringing this back to the place where it happened. Whether the stains are real, but does this somehow increase our compassion or understanding for these stories we've heard so much about? Anybody? We're switching mics.
Yeah, so I'd offer it does, in the sense of at some point we go 161 years ago, these people fought here, and it can become pretty ethereal pretty quick. It's a beautiful day. Everybody's driving around, generally speaking, with smiles on their faces. And you can lose the horror of these battlefields until you get an object like this that now it becomes incredibly concrete. Like, that had a real function. He's got a sword on that. That's a symbol of command. That's what he's using to guide this battery. He's got a real job here. A graduate of the class of West Point from 1861, he's wearing that because he's commanding a battery, and the battery's getting pounded. They lose 4 guns during the bombardment. 4 of his caissons go off high order. Although he's wounded in the shoulder and in the groin, he's holding his intestines in with his left hand. He's ordered off the field. About then, a shell comes in and rips some of the spokes out of one of his last 2 pieces, and his artillerist will like, okay, well, we can leave, and he'll draw his pistol, and he'll remind him of the standard, go get the spare, and he'll change it. And he'll make them roll their last 2 pieces of artillery up to the Union line right next to the 69th Pennsylvania. And of course, it's why he's standing there holding the lanyard of one of those last pieces of canister that the round goes down his mouth. Of course, it was 10 years ago that he was awarded the Medal of Honor, the 64th to be awarded to a Gettysburg soldier, and the last to be awarded to a Civil War soldier. But when you see an object like that, all of a sudden it becomes much more concrete. It's no longer this just an interesting story from the past. Now that's very real as we stand in a very real place.
Very well put, Doug. And let's go with one last one. Dane, what do we have here?
We have a model 1860 staff and field officers sword made by Tiffany and Company that belonged to Alexander Stuart Webb. Has his name engraved on the back there, and also of course the officer depicted in the back monument behind us. Webb was a 33-year had a 33-year term as president of the City University of New York, and there's a similar monument to him up in New York as what's seen here at Gettysburg.
Wow, again, you know, the beautiful sword. I think I've seen this one. This is one of the only pieces I've seen out here before. We can't thank you enough. We're going to see more from the National Civil War Museum in Harrisburg. We can't thank you enough. Make sure you go visit that place when you're in this area. It is definitely worth a visit. So thanks so much, Dane. Wayne?
I just want to say, in these two objects link, so the belt of Cushing and this sword for Webb, it's, remember, Cushing goes to Webb and asks to remain permission to stay with his battery when he's here, because he's been hit in the shoulder and hit in the groin, and he's pretty badly wounded, but he wants to request permission from Brigadier General Webb to remain with his guns, which he does, and those 2 advanced guns right up here by where we're standing. He had 6 guns here in action, and he probably had 2 that were right up here along the stone wall when he's killed, which of course are overrun by men of Armstead's brigade and the others.
My word, we could stand here and talk for a good 4 or 5 hours, a 4 or 5 hour tour of the angle that Kris is focusing on right here. This is the angle in the stone wall off to the right that lends this place its name, but we got to keep walking. We got to cover more of the Union defense. It didn't just happen here, and I'm going to invite Doug and Wayne to just continue this story.
Well, so if we imagine, we said that, hey, Armstead's men break through, and the debate is how many men? No more than a couple hundred, of course. We talked about the Union soldiers advancing. They're reacting, right? This is, we learn from the past, we anticipate the future, and inevitably you anticipate the future wrong, so you must adapt to your current conditions. Union soldiers attacking from the south. About this point, Webb will get the 71st and the 72nd Pennsylvania to launch a counterattack that will drive those last few score of Confederates back over the wall to secure this part of the Union line. What we're going to do is transition to what we would call the outer angle. As we do so, we're going to pass some batteries that are here. We have Arnold's battery. We have now moved largely from Pickett's division. We're starting to enter into where Trimble's and Pettigrew's division would be coming across the field. One of the attacks we talked about earlier in the day. Anything to add?
Yeah, I just want to say, Burkett Fry, the brigade for Archer, he commands Archer's brigade, is up against Pickett's division, and they come into where the angle is located too. So you've got some Tennesseans, you've got them mixed, there's Alabama in there, but you got the Tennesseans in there mixed with some of these Virginians coming right up against this wall. And as we go on the outer angle, and then as we head north here, the artillery in the Union positions, we're still passing the 2nd Corps, but we're going to go over to Alexander Hayes' division now and talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, one of my favorite stories about Burkett Fry is, number one, his brigade is going to be basically the guiding post for Pickett's charge as they come across. They'll be coming across these fields over here, but Fry is captured after Pickett's charge. He's wounded here, and he's taken to Fort McHenry. And while he's recovering in Fort McHenry, he's accused of murdering Robert McCook, one of the 17 fighting McCooks in the Civil War. And while he's laying there, John Gibbon, also wounded here at the battle, fighting for the Union, goes to Fort McHenry, walks into one of the wards, and sees his old West Point classmate, Burkett Fry. And the reason he knew it was him, because of his prominent and protruding nose. That's how he knew his former classmate, and also vouched for him, saying, this man is not a murderer.
this is interesting too. You know, as we move from this part of the from the inner angle, two different modes of defense. When we think about how Webb lines it up, he does his defense in depth. It's regiments forward and regiments back. Alexander Haig doesn't do that. What he's going to do is he's going to put as many men as he can up on this wall. They say there are as many as 4 deep. And you go, well, that's kind of crazy. But imagine the firepower they're generating. And even when we think about, you know, statistically speaking, who are the killers, only about 15% of people in war are actually aiming and try and kill people. Now, that doesn't mean everybody has a job, but when we think about the killing power of Alexander Haig's men up here, all the guys in the back that are happy to load and hand rifles forward are handing them forward to the guys who are willing to do the shooting and the killing. And so you can imagine the volume of fire. In fact, even as we look out, you can see a fence line here. The Union soldiers start to tear it down, and it's going to be the Sergeant Major of the 14th Connecticut that's going to say, no, no, leave it up, because that becomes an obstacle for the Confederates who are going to attack across this field. Imagine having to navigate that fence line as you attack into this Union position. We're about to come
Doug, let me just jump in real fast. It's hard to cut in and Doug. But this is where you get the Fredericksburg feel. After this battle is repulsed, or this attack is repulsed, the Federals will start chanting Fredericksburg. And at Fredericksburg, the Federals took on a Confederate fixed fortified position that started with two ranks deep, and by the end of the day at the sunken road at Marie's Height, it was 8 to 10 ranks deep. Men in the rear firing, or men in the front rank firing, men in the rear loading, and the men in the middle passing forward unloaded and loaded muskets. And one man said he fired so many times that day, his elbow, from his right elbow to his right hip, was black and blue for the next 2 weeks. So this is now Hayes's division pouring that firepower back onto these Confederates and returning the favor from December of 1862.
Yeah, I can't stress enough things. There's so many comments, I can't even get to them all. I'm glad you all are here. It's not a video unless Kris brings up the McCooks or Norwich University or both. So
or Ypres.
yeah, there you go. I want to say a couple other things, you know, and here as we work our way into the less known part of the Union defense here at Pickett's Charge, but no less important, I read an account, I like Wayne still does to this day, like to pull pension records and understand what soldiers went through. A member of the 12th New Jersey here was actually stationed along this wall during the bombardment when a Confederate shell came in and splattered rock across his face, and that was his Civil War wound. He was permanently scarred forever with deep scars all over his face. You don't think about a wound like that. You only think about direct hits or shrapnel or something like that. You're with the American Battlefield Trust. Here we are on Cemetery Ridge on July 3rd for Gettysburg 161. We're with Kris White, Sarah Kay Bierle, with Doug Douds, and Wayne Motts. And we are still walking along Cemetery Ridge, and we're going to work our way towards Ziegler's Grove. There's Doug.
Hey, imagine, you know, this 12th New Jersey Regiment here, they're still armed with smoothbores, buck and ball. So many of their shots don't come when the Confederates cross the road. They're going to wait. Effectively knowing the effective range of the smoothbore rifle or muskets is not that great. So what this is because there's no fire here, many Confederates will work their way into the frontage of the 12th New Jersey, which meaning this is starting to pack up and become thicker and thicker. Ultimately, when that regiment finally does unleash its volley, of course, it just wreaks havoc in those Confederate lines that were already mixed together. The disintegration of the Confederate line had already happened as they crossed the Emmitsburg Road, and now when they finally found some safe space to be in, then all of a sudden they get hit by the 12th New Jersey.
Doug, I want to try to lead Kris, if we can, a little bit down here. I want to move down here and talk a little bit about the extreme left of this attack, which is the 11th Mississippi. We had a gentleman that saw us before we went on film, and he was wearing a shirt that said the University Grays, which is one of the units. The Mississippi folks put up a monument here, very close to where the stone wall is, for July 3rd, 1863. And this is it. It's one of the newer monuments at Gettysburg, which shows the 11th Mississippi flag, which is still in existence at the American Civil War Museum down in Richmond, Virginia. This regiment probably takes the highest level of casualties for any unit in the assault on July 3rd. They had the 393 men, as you can see, and you can see the total amount of casualties. But I want to come down, Kris, why don't you move down here, because we're only going to come right here to this corner. But we're on the west side of Abraham Bryan's barn. And Abraham Bryan, a free African-American who was fled at the time of the battle. The house is right over here behind it, just to the east of it. And the 11th Mississippi gets right up here in this field. It's over here, right here behind where I'm standing. They're in the middle of this field. And meanwhile, they're getting hit on the left by troops that are right over here from Alexander Hayes' division. And what do? They rush to come up to this barn. And they actually are right behind this barn, the 11th Mississippi, and there's a man named William Peel. Peel was in Company C of the 11th Mississippi, and they got right up here behind the barn, and they're shooting out from around where the barn is located. And the Union troops are right up at the stone wall. So you got a 20-foot difference here between where the Union troops are and where the Confederate troops are. And they finally said, we can't stay here, and if you try to retreat off of here, you're going to get hit. Running a gauntlet back to where the Emmitsburg Road is and back to Confederate lines. So William Peel tells us in his diary that they float white flags from around the barn and they surrender right here behind where this barn is, about 20 feet from where the Union troops are, and they get taken out of the gate that's right over here behind where I'm at.
I want to thank you, Wayne, for calling this audible and coming down, because look at this view. Look at the 11th Mississippi marker. I know our friend Don Barrett will be happy to see that. Look at how Cemetery Ridge does sort of crest right over there, and you're seeing a new part of the battlefield, which is what our goal is. And another audible we're calling is that our friends at the National Civil War Museum, we were going to cover it from the top, but one particular item concerns something y'all, the members of the trust, have helped to preserve, some of the land of the 8th Ohio, which swung around to outflank Confederates here next to what we now call General Pickett's Buffet, or used to. Dane?
Yeah, so we have a Case Tim type image of Private Edward Jones, Company A of the 8th Ohio, and then on his right is Commissary Sergeant Lemuel Snover, also the same regiment. Both are sitting in their uniforms with a camp backdrop in the background, U.S. flag flying in the background. Jones was mortally wounded in the fight here with a gunshot wound to the head in the repulse of the fighting on the third day. Very close to the position of that regiment, and very important artifact, featured prominently in a publication as well.
Very, very cool. I think Doug might have something to say. I'll give him my mic in a sec. As we start to make our way toward the top, but we appreciate the National Civil War Museum allowing us to be like little temporary curators. It's an honor to hold these objects and even smell them, as you'll notice I have when I'm off camera. There's something about it to get closer. I see Sarah even holding an object as well. So Doug, what do you got?
Hey, one of the things we don't often talk about during Pickett's Charge, there's so much going on. We talk about the pre-bombardment, but one of the things we don't often talk about is the Union skirmish line. It is out there just beyond the Emmitsburg Road, and we can have one of the members of the 108th New York that's out there is, hang on, Corporal William H. Raymond. He was an incredibly tall guy. You can see by his face, maybe a little thin from all this campaigning. What's going to happen is they're going to run out of ammunition. And of course, while they're out there working the skirmish line, somebody's got to go back and get it. So he says, I'll do it. And he runs back here, being fired at the whole time, to the cheers of the Union troops. And when he gets here, he's going to talk to his brigade commander, Colonel Smith, who's going to say, okay, yeah, here's some ammunition. He goes, well, somebody's got to carry it back. And without missing a beat, Raymond will look around and go, well, I could carry it as well as anyone. And so he's going to hoist it on his shoulder. He's going to sprint back out into the field, guys shooting at him the whole time, and only at the last does he dive in with his compatriots out there on the skirmish line. His fellows will be patting him on the back going, oh, I can't believe you made it. And they're going to distribute the ammunition, and many would say it was because Raymond was so slender that he survived, despite the fact that he had 7 bullet holes in his uniform for that effort. And of course, for having resupplied his compatriots, he would be awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions on July 3rd, 1863.
Wow, Doug.
Gary, could you remind him, we have just to remind all of our viewers, we do have a monument database as well as a Medal of Honor database over at battlefields.org if you want to learn more about where these medals were earned, and as well as more about the people.
And I think that's a great thing to remind people. We have videos, we have all sorts of programs, we do things for schools. And by the way, it is your membership of the American Battlefield Trust that supports programs like this that allow us to come out to the battlefield and do these special things while we walk around. And if you think that we're scratching the surface of the knowledge of Wayne Motts and Doug Douds, you are wrong. Come to Gettysburg, get a licensed battlefield guide, explore the parts of the field that are of interest to you. And here, as we walk by the Bryan Farm, an actual wartime house, it has been reconstructed on the original foundation. It's been enlarged over the years here. Oh, he's trying to get us to go in, but we're petrified of losing connectivity. Well, our friends at the National Civil War Museum Museum are going to have even more as we go into a place called Ziegler's Grove. Before I hand it to Dane, you good? Do you want to set this up here, Wayne? Well, but just real quick before you do, I think he's going to talk. Wayne, Kris is trying to calm me down here. He's going to talk about the 111th New York, their monuments on the other side of this building. We're going to eventually talk about Willard's Brigade as well, sometimes known as the Harper's Ferry Cowards. We'll see. So what do you got to say, Wayne, Dane?
So we have two artifacts here belonging to Edward Bovee, an 18-year-old when he enlisted in July of 1862 as a private from Lyons, New York, in the 111th New York, Company B. He would be transferred out of the regiment for wounds received the prior day here at Gettysburg, July the 2nd, and he would serve in the 21st Regiment of the Veteran Reserve Corps, Company K. So what Mike's holding in his right hand there is a Austrian Lorenz bayonet for a 54 caliber musket. You can turn that in your hand there, and you can see the sharp angle with which that front sight goes up into the socket of that bayonet. Very, very different from what you'd see on a Springfield bayonet, where you have an L-shaped pattern. So a very, very distinctive bayonet. And then on the left here, we have a reunion ribbon from 1888, which acknowledges the first reunion of the 111th New York, proudly presents their role in the Battle of Gettysburg here in red, and their experience from Harper's Ferry to Appomattox. Of course, at Harper's Ferry, that regiment was entirely captured, and then they were subsequently paroled to come into action here at Gettysburg. And they had a day of redemption here on July 3rd and July 2nd.
The Harper's Ferry cowards no more, and that was not fair to start with, and then they were able to absolve themselves. We're going to go a little further. We have more artifacts to show, but I know I could see Wayne and Doug and others just ready to talk more. Looks like Kris has something.
Yes, I've been holding the microphone as Garry took the microphone from someone else. I just want to talk about the bayonet for just a minute. Mike's showing us this is a socket bayonet. This means it'll go on the end of your gun, the muzzle of the gun. It'll lock in place using this screw and lock system. Slide it over the top of the front sight. You don't want to break off that front sight. It's pretty important. And then you would have this bayonet placed on there, and you could still load and fire the musket. It is an urban legend that a three-pointed or this kind of triangular shaped bayonet was against the Articles of War because it created grievous wounds. That is not true. That's one of those urban legends. And these reunion ribbons that we see here, tons of these things are around, and they're really great to see because it tells us more of the stories about when these men are finally getting back together here more than 25 years after the battle.
Excellent, Kris. A few people are asking a lot of questions. A few people are commanding us to go to other places, and a few say please once in a while. But I want to say that, somebody asked, do you think we all, the historians, do we go out like for lunch? We're dead? Okay.
We can continue recording.
Okay. And we'll pick it up. So, yes, we do go out for lunch after this. And I think with that, we're going to show off one or two more artifacts, and then we're going to cut. So just real quick, come on over here, guys. We're going to cut it with this. We run into connectivity issues. You never know when. Hurry up, Dane.
Okay, so the next artifact I'd like to cover is the headquarters official report from Major General George Meade to Assistant Adjutant General Seth Williams. This is his General Order number 68, which thanks the Army of the Potomac officially for the recent operations here at Gettysburg and their successful victory. This would have been published appropriately July 4th, 1863, Independence Day. And you have a very proud general after this battle. Of course, mixed reviews of Meade's victory would come out later. And then we have two other objects, both of which relate to the commemoration that occurred here at Gettysburg. An 1885 marked cane that belonged to Brigadier General Joseph B. Carr. This was retrieved from wood that was at the angle. Carr, of course, his units would not be at the angle, but it had a lasting impact on his memory of the battle, what occurred there, and it meant something for him to collect that. And then we also had a celluloid badge with the likeness of Carr from the 1913 reunion.
Good, good. Thanks so much, Dane. You know, we are going to have more videos coming up, but thanks so much to the National Civil War Museum for everything. I'm not sure if we're going to see them anymore, but we might have some other objects coming up on other videos. To Dane and Mike, Sarah, Doug, Wayne, I think I know their names, Kris behind the camera, Andy back at headquarters, you all for watching. Thanks for all your support of battlefield education and preservation.
Hello, this is Trace Atkins. To stay up to date on all the latest and coolest videos, please subscribe to the Trust YouTube channel. Preserve, educate, inspire.